Requiem of a Timeline by EvanescentDream93. Time, like love, is nothing to be trifled with. Both are delicate and both lead down a road with unexpected results. So, will you take my hand as the world crashes down around us? Violet and Wilbur, Chapter 1, Prologue. And so it ends. In the late 80s, an anti-super bill was passed in Congress, making any super vigilante work illegal and ending what was once called the Golden Age of Supers. Supers stepped down to hide in the framework of society, creating new lives and hiding their old ones, hated and forgotten by the ones they had sworn to protect. It would take over a decade and one madman under the name of Syndrome to remind the world of the glory days and to bring supers back to the pedestal of society. Leading the forefront of the rebirth of the Golden Age of Supers were the Incredibles, a superfamily of Golden Age supers Mr. Incredible and Mrs. Incredible formerly, Elastigirl, and their children Invisigirl, the Dash, and later Morpheus. The Incredibles led a new generation of heroes, fondly called the Capeless Generation, due to an inexplicable trend of not wearing capes. When asked about the lack of such a superhero iconic symbol, the only reply was, "She doesn't do capes anymore." The Incredibles, along with the National Supers Agency, or NSA, promoted the civil rights of supers across the nation. Though many criticized the government and their reliance on supers, some argued Wilbur Robinson, the startled 5-year-old, fumbled with the remote to the television in a useless attempt to seem innocent despite being caught red-handed. Though, in his defense, how was he expected to go asleep when the television network had decided to show an old documentary about supers when it was past his bedtime? Young Wilbur Robinson thought of it as injustice and would have thoroughly declared it so if his young mind could come up with such a word as injustice, and if his mother wasn't such a scary woman when angered. "Wilbur Robinson," his mother repeated, hands on her hips as she stared down the young boy. "Why are you not in bed?" Getting up quickly in all his spaceship footy pajama glory. The boy raised his hand, pointing a finger up, as he had seen his father do once in a boring lecture he had been forced to sit through. His father's inventions themselves were amazing to the child. The actual science behind them, not so much. "That," he said, "is a very excellent question." Holding back a laugh at her son's antics, Franny Robinson sighed before bending down to pick up her son. "Okay, space adventurer, time for bed." "Aw, Mom, do I have to?" Wilbur whined. "Yes," his mother answered as she stepped into one of the transport tubes, landing in the boy's room filled with toys and child drawings of superheroes and space explorers. On the wall above where his bed was placed was a scribbled drawing with stick figure representations of each member of his family, including himself in a cape. "Okay," Franny said, tucking Wilbur into bed. "Night-night, good-night. Don't let the space bugs bite," she sang. A drowsy Wilbur turned over onto his side, letting out a yawn. "Silly Mom. Space bugs. Only bite girls." Mrs. Robinson smiled softly before planting a gentle kiss on her son's forehead, before slipping out of the room and letting him dream of heroes without capes, space bugs, and force fields. Chapter 2. Drunken Fate. Intoxication, inebriation, overpowering exhilaration, drunkenness. She wasn't tipsy. No, that had been several shots ago. Nope, nope, nope. Violet Parr was high as a kite wasted. Tripping over her own feet, the 17-year-old crawled on the floor, somehow invading being stepped on by her peers as the bass continued to pound loudly throughout the house of some classmate that she honestly couldn't remember in her drunken state. "Mr. Phone," she called out, searching for the black cellular device. "Where are you?" Pushing her hair back from her face, Violet pouted. This wasn't working out well for her. Honestly, she couldn't even remember why she wanted her phone. So, phone forgotten, she stumbled out of the tangle of sweaty bodies and sex. Stepping outside, she was hit by the night's fresh air, and for a moment her mind cleared. She should have never came to this party. The people, the music, the booze, especially the booze. She thought feeling a wave of nausea begin were certainly not the Violet Parr she had grown up to be. So why was she at this party, wearing a ridiculously short red mini dress, heavy makeup, and sporting a leather jacket that the original owner obviously wasn't using, whomever they were? They wore nice-smelling cologne and drunk, to the point that she was starting to forget her own name. Hormones. Plain and simple. The usual girl sees guy. Girl thinks guy is beyond attractive. Girl foolishly tries to change herself for guy. Girl goes to party. Girl finds guy mindlessly snogging girl's best friend. Girl gets drunk to wash her pride away. Violet wasn't heartbroken. Even intoxicated, she knew that any feelings towards the boy were a mix of lust and trying to break free from her family. Not that her family was horrible. There were, of course, the occasional disagreements with her brother and her parents, but ever since supers were welcomed back openly in society, her family was doing considerably better. Her mother had seemed less of a killjoy. Her father had become healthier. And Dash was still Dash, but at least she didn't want to kill him every day now. So why the rebellion then? Even Violet wasn't too sure, though she had learned to embrace her powers a year ago and learned to be proud of her heritage. She supposed the pressure of not just being any super, but the daughter of Mr. Incredible and Elastigirl was tiring. She and her family, when they were not saving the world, were constantly going to different places to promote super civil rights as ambassadors of the NSA. Sure, many people were thankful that supers like Mr. Incredible had returned to protect the innocent without any grudges. But there were still many people who weren't opposed to having supers treated like second-class citizens by promoting the legalization of mandatory restrictions when it came to how supers worked, traveled, and even lived. Technically, she and her siblings were felonies themselves, since one of the old super laws now repealed, as a sort of favor to the Incredibles, was that it was illegal for supers to breed. It had nearly been genocide. Accepting that the road as Invisagirl, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Incredibles, would be filled with obstacles, there was a part of Violet that wished her future options weren't so limited. Oh, of course she could have a secret identity as anything she wanted, but in the end, her full commitment went towards protecting the citizens of her city. So into her thoughts and her balance, since she had chosen to wear ridiculously high heels, Violet, despite all her training her parents had provided, was unaware of the person coming up silently behind her, until a cloth was pressed against her mouth and nose, and she felt the world around her slip away. Target acquired. Chapter 3. The hands on the clock stop. Drinking was a horrible, horrible thing, she came upon the realization. Her head hurt. The lights were too bright when she tried to open up her eyes. Her stomach decided to do flips, and her pillow was humming. Eddie, her pillow was humming. Her pillow was humming! Not having enough balance in her current state, Violet flipped away from the person holding her, landing on her hands and knees instead of her feet, and coming to the realization that the concrete gray floor she was staring at was not the beige carpet of her room. Vi, calm down. It's just me. Mom? Violet asked, as her vision showed two Helen Parrs, crisscrossing constantly before settling into just one. Ooh, where are we? Before her mother could answer the question, a steel gray door that she hadn't noticed before opened, revealing Agent Rick Dicker. Good. You're awake, he said, looking down at Violet. Did you explain the situation to her? He directed at Helen. Never before had her mother looked so old and worn out as she helped her daughter up. As they followed Agent Dicker down the hall, Violet noticed that her mother's shaking hand hadn't let go of hers since she had helped her up, and the death-like grip she had on it scared Violet. Though it was probably painfully obvious that Violet was struggling through a hangover, it was even more obvious that that was the furthest thing from her mother's mind. Plus, the fact that they were with Agent Dicker, despite him being an old friend of the family, was never a good sign. That scared her more. The bleak hallway they were in finally ended at another steel gray door that looked identical and markless as all the other doors they had passed by. Dicker pressed a code into a keypad next to the door before stepping back to let the females in. Violet lost her balance, though. This time it wasn't because of the side effects to the alcohol she had consumed hours ago. What time was it actually now? Her lack of balance this time had been caused by her brothers, both who were clinging to her in a hug, Dash burying his face into the material of her dress, and Jack with his small arms around one of her legs, imitating his brother in the tense atmosphere. She looked to her mother, but Mrs. Parr was already making her way over to her husband, who had his head in his hands, looking more dejected than he had ever had in the time before they came out as the Incredibles. Lucius, who had been comforting Bob at a sleek metal table, stepped back and allowed Helen to wrap her arms around her husband's shoulders, a silent tear falling from her eyes as they both tried to hold it together. Violet was thoroughly confused and believed that even 3-year-old Jack had a better idea of what was going on than she did. A tan hand found itself on her shoulder, and Violet was surprised to turn and find Mirage behind her, holding a pile of clothes. "Here, you should change into these." About to question why she needed the dress was a little bit shorter than what was modest, but it wasn't that bad. Violet gasped when she realized that the upper part of her dress had a long, jagged cut that went from the top down to her navel that had not been there when she left the party. Color drained from her face as hazed memories drifted back. She pulled the leather jacket she still wore tighter around her, like a security blanket. There was a man. She hadn't noticed him until he had snuck up behind her and pressed that cloth to her face. But what had happened after that? "Follow me," Mirage said gently, pulling Violet away from her brothers. Violet wanted to pull away from the woman, to grab and hug her brothers like the stuffed purple octopus she had had when she was little. However, the woman proved much stronger than the young super at the moment, and led her down another hall, till they finally stepped into what must have been the women's locker room. Turning, bloodshot indigo eyes stared back at a pale face, framed by disheveled, inky black hair. She looked horrible. There was a bruise on her temple that, on retrospect, seemed to be the actual cause for most of her headache, along with the indulgence of beer she had had. Placing a shaky hand on her throat, Violet pulled away a bandage that was there. Mirage watched silently as the younger female saw the thin cut on her throat. It was a shallow cut, but the implications of it were terrifying. What happened?" Wide, fragile eyes turned to sympathetic ones. Mirage took a step towards the girl, pulling off the leather jacket from the trembling girl's shoulder, making Violet feel all the more exposed. "Let me help you." Turning the girl around to unzip the back of the dress, Mirage was silent until the dress was pulled around the girl's feet. A few days ago, the NSA's computer files were hacked by a group of radical anti-super reformists. They took all of our files on registered supers, powers, weaknesses, secret identities. Shock showed on Violet's face as she stumbled back, tangling herself in the dark pants Mirage was helping her into. It took all her training and every ounce of her willpower not to turn herself invisible. That would be the easy way out, and as a member of the Incredibles, her pride won out and she stayed visible. "So, they know who we are?" Mirage took a seat on one of the benches that were in the middle of 2 rows of lockers, patting the space next to her. Violet sat down, allowing the woman to wrap an arm around her shoulder. 3 years ago, Violet would have been hesitant to allow this display of affection, but Mirage had proven time after time that she was on their side now. When, after one more comforting squeeze, Mirage dropped her arm and pulled the bandage that was still around Violet's neck off before continuing. "We were tipped by one of our sources that your family would be the prime target, and even if we hadn't, it's obvious that as representatives between the super and non-super communities, that the Incredibles would be attacked first. We just didn't know when. And they attacked when I wasn't with my family," Violet concluded. Mirage nodded. "Yes, we had agents to follow each of you during your daily lives, since the radicals would surely attack when you were dressed as civilians." "After all," Mirage said, eyes hardening, "who would not want to attack a 17-year-old girl while she was walking home alone in the middle of the night intoxicated?" Violet glared back at Mirage, but the older woman waved it off. "I'm not you, Mother, so I won't lecture you." Violet sighed in relief. "But you should be very aware of how close you came to coming to harm," she said, pointing to the cut that ran across her throat. Violet gulped, resting a hand against the cut. It was already healing, but she wouldn't be surprised if a scar would be there for the rest of her life. Was I... She couldn't finish her question. Her torn dress seemed like an obvious clue. However, Mirage sighed, shoulders sagging before shaking her heads. By the time our agents arrived on the scene, you were found propped up against a wall, your attacker beaten and knocked unconscious. We thought that perhaps you had done it. But you were not only drugged by the attacker, but also drunk. Even if you had seen the attacker coming, I doubt you could have really done that much damage. Looking straight at Violet, she tucked a strand of the super's long hair behind her ear, giving a comforting smile. Whoever your guardian angel was, you should be thankful to them. Nodding, Violet was still unsure about many things, but her family's previous state made sense now. Somewhat. There's more, isn't it? She asked, wishing that Mirage would not answer affirmatively. Unfortunately, that was exactly what happened. Pulling a now fully dressed Violet up to her feet, Mirage led the way back to room where her family was located. As of 2 a.m. today, Mirage said before opening the door, all known private information on registered supers has been put on the internet. There's no place for you to hide any longer. It was then that she felt her breathing stop, her world coming crashing down. She did the only thing she could do in this situation. She turned invisible, not letting anyone see the tears. Chapter 4. Run, but wrong time to hide. So I was like, yeah, huh? And she was like, nah, huh? And I couldn't believe her because, yeah, huh, she totally did. I was totally right, so I couldn't believe her. And now Brace is free, but still ever so talkative. Kari McKean said into her phone receiver, balancing her cell on her shoulder as she painted her toes, the TV mutely playing in front of her. So then I called her best friend's boyfriend's friend's second cousin's mother, and she said it wasn't true, which I totally knew from the beginning. She screwed the cap back onto the nail polish bottle before examining her toes. Sparkly orange paint had managed to get all over the skin around the actual nails. She waved it off. She would wait till the polish dried before trying to use a Q-tip to clean it up a bit. Reaching for the remote, Kari flipped through the channels, bored. So yeah, she's like, totally crazy and... What? Channel 8 news? Doesn't the news have the clock read 3:25, 2 hours before it comes on? Holding the phone away from her ear, she clenched her teeth as the other person yelled at her to switch channels. Geez, take a chill pill, Kari said, though she did change to channel 8. There wasn't much to make Kari speechless, though one could add seeing the picture of Violet Parr, her best friend, though images of the other night's party floated back to her mind. Kissing some random guy, a shocked Violet, having a major hangover when she had reawakened in a bed that wasn't her own, made her stomach knot right next to an image of Invisigirl, and then listed that the two people were the same people, could definitely be added to the list of things that make Kari McKean shut up. Requiem of a timeline. It had taken a few deep breaths and a mental pep talk for Violet to become visible once again. She joined her family, who had been anxiously waiting for her return, at the table. With the knowledge of what happened to her after the party, she had to take a moment to hug both her mother and father before moving to her siblings. Once that was through, the meeting could begin. We've decided to start a program, Dicker said in his usual serious tone. It's open to all consenting supers, of course. The NSA and the government realize that we owe way too much to all of you to force you to this, he said, looking at all the members of the Incredibles and Frozone. What else can we do, other than accept whatever this plan is? Bob slammed his fist down on the table, his grief turning to anger. It was horrible enough when we were forced to not use our powers. What makes us us? Bob, Helen exclaimed, trying to calm down her husband. Mr. Parr ignored his wife, standing from his seat. But at least then, we still had some kind of reassurance that if anyone ever found out our secret identities, it was because we had screwed up. This time the government did, and it's not something that can be fixed with your memory erasing machine. Robert! What? Helen and Bob looked at each other, both stressed and angered. After a few stressed moments, they sat down quietly, Bob reaching for Helen's hand under the table, squeezing it reassuringly as they both took strength from each other. Violet watched this display silently. Her parents needed support, And she was amazed that in this tense atmosphere they could stand together like this. They were truly incredible. Just from what Mirage had told her alone, had caused Violet to want to hide in a hole and never come out. She wondered if she'd ever have the chance to meet someone who would support her, cry with her, love her like her parents did each other. Glancing over at Dash, she knew when their eyes connected that he was relying on her as his older sister. Despite having the cocky attitude of any 13-year-old boy, Violet was still his older sister, and she couldn't just fall apart right in front of him. She had had long discussions with her parents about breaking from the team once she turned 18 and creating her own super identity. This responsibility was much bigger than getting a new costume design, though she'd still be doing the same thing she had been doing since she was 14. The risks would be greater. She would more than likely move to a different city that needed a super. No one would be watching her back anymore. If she ever found herself overwhelmed by her opponent, that was it. Game over. She and her parents had spent long nights discussing the responsibility of this. Back then it had seemed difficult but straightforward. Back then, she had a secret identity to hide behind. No longer, but the same amount of responsibility, maybe even more with the current situation, was being placed on her shoulder, and she had to be strong, if not for herself, then at least for her family. So what's this plan you have for us? Lucius asked, breaking the silence. Nodding to Mirage, Dicker allowed the woman to place a file on the table before the supers. I mean, it's obvious that just moving us to another location won't work. As I'm sure, you have all probably heard of cryogenics, the study of materials and organisms at very, very cold temperatures, Mirage stated as Bob opened the file. Within it were several sheets, but the first was of a black and white photo of an old man. The first person whose body was cryonically preserved was James Bedford in 1967. Since then, others who have feared death have tried this method, hoping that in the future they'll be able to be revived. Wait, just hold on a sec, Lucius interrupted. I hope the crazy thought I'm thinking is not the same crazy thought that you're about to propose to us. Actually, it is, Agent Dicker affirmed. Even before the first anti-super laws, we've been planning this just in case. Rest assured that what you've heard in the media about the topic of freezing a person has been purely fictional. The government couldn't just let anyone know that the process can work, Mirage added. Helen blinked. Can? Mirage looked at the other woman. Violet knew that though the two would never be close as friends, they did hold a mutual respect for the other. Frenemies without the pleasantries and backhanded comments. If there was something they didn't like, neither woman would hesitate to point it out to the other. As it can only work for people with high metabolic rates and neural activity. Supers, to be exact. Mirage looked at Lucius. Unfortunately, it doesn't work for non-supers, which is why this is an optional alternative. Violet looked at the adults in this room. This all seemed too much for her to comprehend. Did things really need to be this extreme? Luckily, Dash thought the same thing. Isn't this like, a little drastic? I mean, you're turning us to popsicles. Violet nodded, finding herself unable to speak, though she probably wouldn't have said it any better herself. You're right, son. It is drastic. Agent Dicker nodded. But you don't have that many options. Your identities are out in the open. Some will praise you, some will treat you like gods, and others will fear and hate you. Unfortunately, it seems likely that the latter will happen. You all can return home, but from there the NSA won't be able to do much in terms of protection for you. You'll always be on your guard, and you'll never be able to trust anyone outside of this group again. You'll be segregated because of your differences. However, if you take this opportunity, the NSA can give you another chance at a new life. It may be like how life was before you came out as the Incredibles, but your personal lives will be safe in a time that may be better prepared for the existence of supers. The room was silent. If Violet thought the room was tense before then, she honestly didn't know what she was experiencing now. Her parents looked at each other, as if asking each other what to do, what would be good for their family. But, she said, years of progress going down the drain, as everyone turned his or her attention towards Violet. She fiddled with her hands as she continued. But what about the people we're supposed to protect? No one answered. and the question hung in the air like a heavy weight. The answer was obvious, though. In order to protect their family, they would have to be selfish. Agent Dicker allowed them all to go to private rooms that had been turned to makeshift apartments for their super guests, giving them time to think the proposal over. Tired, the Parr family all found themselves climbing into beds that didn't hold the comfort of their own. Violet shifted, trying not to disturb Dash and Jack, who were also sharing the bed with her. Things just seemed so surreal, including the prospect of being frozen for an indefinite amount of time until the situation blew over. If it ever blows over, she thought sullenly to herself, drifting into a fitful sleep. When she awoke in the morning, her parents were huddled over a table, holding each other's hands like the other was their tether to the earth. They were whispering quietly to each other, still not aware that she was awake. She watched silently as Bob pushed a lock of hair out of Helen's face, her mother placing her small hand on top of Bob's much larger hand, keeping it on her cheek as they stared into the other's eyes. It was simple, yet so deeply intimate that Violet closed her eyes, pushing away thoughts of heartbreaking boys, lying best friends, and a world truly without supers. Instead, she focused on Jack's even breathing and Dash's snoring, lulling her into a brief sense of security before falling back to sleep. She couldn't exactly remember when or how the decision was made official, but soon after she had awakened for the second time, she and her family were quickly brought over to a larger section of the NSA. The room they entered was full of agents in suits and scientists in lab coats, all shuffling around with a great sense of urgency. In the middle of all of this were 5 capsules, attached to a machine that seemed to hum loudly as wisps of cold fog escaped from it. With all the cords and wires around the room, Violet couldn't help but feel intimidated by it all. After all, her life was being put into these machines' metaphorical hands. Lucius greeted them sadly. She already knew that he wouldn't be participating. Honey wasn't a super, and the Iceman wasn't going to leave his loved one behind unprotected, but he also couldn't leave without saying goodbye to what had become like his second family. Lucius picked Jack up, tossing him in the air, eliciting a squeal of joy from the young boy before putting him down, ruffling Dash's hair before they both knocked fists together, the speedster holding back tears. Violet received a strong hug, followed by her mother before Lucius came to Bob. Both men stared at each other. They were the definition of true brothers in everything but blood. They had been through a lot in their younger days, and both men held back tears as they shook hands before embracing the other, tightly, before the entire family joined in for a group hug. "Whenever you're ready," Mirage said, as if she wished she didn't have to intrude upon such an intimate moment. "See you in the future, partner," Bob saluted. "See you in the future." Lucius nodded back before stepping back from the family and allowing Mirage to usher them forward. "It's simple. One by one, each of you will get into a capsule," she explained. "Once you're in there, you will be injected with a sedative that's supposed to help with the freezing process. Soon after that," she trailed off before forcing a smile on her "soon after that, the next time you wake up, you'll be in a better time." Mr. Parr placed his hand on the white hair woman's shoulder. "Thank you," he said, nodding to Agent Dicker. "Both of you. It wasn't always easy to work with you," Dicker said, turning his back towards the family, hiding his emotions. "But I damn sure don't know of any man," he said, looking over his shoulder at Bob before looking at the rest of the Parrs, "or any group of people that I would rather work with." And with that, the process began. Mr. Incredible was first. He kissed his wife and hugged his children tightly before he stepped in. He was able to give his family thumbs up before they closed the capsule. Violet felt her mother's hands on her shoulder tighten as she looked at her husband. Bob gave them all one final look before the inside of the capsule was flash frozen with liquid nitrogen. Violet tried to avoid the stillness in her father's face. It looked too much like death. Time seemed to go slow. Dash and Jack were next, followed by Helen. When Violet looked back up, she was the last one. Hesitantly stepping into the capsule, Violet took her last final look around, trying to remember the last glimpse of things familiar to her, but nothing other than Agent Dicker, Mirage and Lucius were remotely familiar. She felt a pinch on her shoulder as the sedative was injected into her, the capsule closing. Eyes nearly half closed, she struggled to keep her eyes opened as muffled sounds of gunshots, screams, and alarms suddenly started outside of her capsule. She wasn't sure what was happening as she felt herself lose consciousness. All she was aware of in her final moments was the same rush she felt every time she created a force field, and the desire to once again see her family before she joined the dead. Then, all she knew was darkness. Chapter 5. He sighs. Child's play. Child's play. He remembers when he was about 6 years old. It had been his father's birthday, and birthdays at the Robinson home were always a special occasion. His young mind had been captivated by the whimsical decorations that Carl strung along the top of the ceiling, the delicious-smelling cookies that Grandma Lucille had been baking, the spectacular fireworks show that Uncle Gaston pulled off with his many cannons, and how pretty his mother looked as she swayed, tapping her foot to the rhythm of the beat, as she conducted her talented frogs in a jazzy rendition of Happy Birthday. He remembers his father, crazed blonde hair thrown back as he laughed in enjoyment, kissing his wife and lifting his son onto his shoulders as they watched Uncle Art drop down a 2-story cake, decorated by Cousin Laszlo, into the backyard. And in his 6-year-old mind, Wilbur Robinson believed that everyone loved his father as much as he and his family did. Wilbur also remembers his parents' confused looks as a strange man walked into their backyard, how his father had passed Wilbur to his mother before asking what the man wanted, and how the strange man yelled at his father, cursing him with words that didn't make sense to the young boy at the time, slandering the name of Cornelius Robinson and Robinson Industry, and saying the supposed father of the future had ended many jobs for many fathers with his inventions that worked faster and harder than any person could. The tears in the man's eyes as he screams that his children don't love a failure like him. He remembers the hatred in the man's eyes as the police hover car took him away after tripping over one of Aunt Billy's mini toy train sets, Uncle Art and Uncle Gaston having held him down. Wilbur's father looks sad, and he tries to shake it off with a forced laugh, suggesting that they should move the festivities inside, but the laughter and good cheer is already gone, and everyone soon heads to their respective rooms after a slightly lackluster repeat of Happy Birthday. Usually his mother tucks him into bed, though sometimes his father hovers in the doorway watching the two most important people in his life. This night, however, it's only his father. Wilbur doesn't mind, though. He knows his father loves him, but he also knows that he's always busy, so he appreciates these moments. No explanation for the day's event is given. No pep talk about keep moving forward is spoken. Instead, Cornelius Robinson takes the time to tell his son a story about special people, some who had super strength, some who could manipulate things around them, and some who were just incredible. He talked about how these people once protected citizens, doing good deeds despite how the public would treat them. If they could improve at least one life, that would be enough. Wilbur remembers his little mind working hard to put things together before looking at his father asking, "So you're one of those people, Dad? A superhero?" Cornelius Robinson shakes his head before chuckling at his son, who showed his disagreement by nodding, little head bobbing up and down. And Wilbur remembers the words that may have set his future into place in his young mind. "You know," his father had said, getting up and turning off the lights, "you're my hero." 11 years later, brown eyes scanned the scene cautiously. A smirk played upon his lips as he hefted his bag before himself through the window and into his room. You know, stairs, and doors for that matter, haven't become extinct," a voice said, startling 17-year-old Wilbur Robinson as light flooded his room. He blinked, eyes readjusting to the brightness as he looked at whoever had caught him sneaking in. Sighing in relief, he relaxed, seeing it was just Carl. "See, dude, you almost gave me a heartache," Wilbur chuckled, kicking his bag under his bed. "Did anyone notice I was gone?" Crossing his arms over his metal chest, Carl shook his head. "No, but all this sneaking around isn't good for my mainframe. You've been doing this almost every night now for weeks. Have you thought about how dangerous this is?" Walking past the gold-plated robot, Wilbur went into the connecting bathroom that had been installed for him years ago. Taking off his shirt, he held back a hiss as he stretched his arm too far, irritating the cut on his side. "Carl," he called, "get the first aid kit." "What? No, please. I tell you, you teenagers have no class," the robot grumbled, though he did return with the box of medical supplies. "I mean, you sneak out late, and then when you come back smelling like cigarettes and sex?" Wilbur filled in nonchalantly. "Shh, don't say that." Carl clamped his hand over the boy's mouth. Rolling his eyes, Wilbur removed his friend's hand and sat down on the sink's counter. Carl seriously needed the child's safety lock turned off in his programming. You know that's the furthest thing from my mind right now," Wilbur muttered as Carl began to treat his wound. "Oh yeah, since you were dumped on your ass last time by that Delilah chick," Carl gave the offhand remark. Wilbur raised a brow. So maybe Carl's programming wasn't censored at all. Getting over his shock, he rolled his eyes. "I wasn't the one who got dumped. Why am I even telling you this?" "Because you have no friends," the robot said with a final tug on the bandages, making them tighter than necessary. Wilbur opened his mouth, then closed it, and then opened it again before saying, "Touché." Hopping down from the sink, Wilbur replaced his shirt with a new one before going back into his room. Rolling his optics, Carl picked up the dirty shirt from the floor where it had been left behind, before tossing it into his stomach cavity to wash later. When he returned his attention back to his charge, he was laying on his bed, an arm thrown over his eyes tiredly. "Honestly, though," Carl said, sitting down at the edge of the boy's bed, "what would your parents think about this?" Wilbur sighed. This wasn't the first time his robot companion had asked him this. Looking out towards his window, he took a few moments before replying, "My dad, he's a great man, and he's done a lot for people. But where does that leave everyone else?" he asked, turning his eyes to his Carl. "We're just left behind trying to catch the tails of his lab coat, and I just want to find my own future." Carl stared at him long and hard before they both erupted into laughter. "I bet that gets the ladies' attention." Wilbur shrugged, though he didn't bother hiding his smirk. "Hey, they can't resist the Robinson charm. Now if you excuse me, I am going to take advantage of the—" he looked at his clock. 3 hours of sleep I have before I have to go to school." "Pshh, like you're not going to just fall asleep in class again." Carl got up, turning off the lights in the room, not noticing Wilbur's grinning face melt into that of pensive thought. No, he would improve the world. Just like his father, he just had to keep moving forward. Metroville. She was nervous. It didn't take a rocket scientist to figure that out. He had been with her for years, and had watched as her always expressive features showed clear as day what she was thinking. Right now, she was biting her bottom lip as she checked over the set list one more time, humming a piece of the score to herself, making sure she had the tempo set in mind. "Edna," he glanced at his cufflink, readjusting it. "Franny, stop worrying," he advised. "I don't know what you're talking about," she mumbled, not looking up from her sheets of music, baton swishing in the air like an annoying fly. He readjusted his tie before sticking out his tongue, grabbing the stick from her hand. "Frankie?" She whirled on him. "Calm down, doll," the amphibian nonchalantly said, placing the baton to the side. "We got you. Have we ever let you down?" he asked, nodding his head towards his fellow green bandmates, who were getting their specially made instruments ready. He remembered her spending long nights working on the instruments, making sure they were light and small enough for the frogs to hold, but still packing the same punch as any regular-sized one. Brown eyes turned towards him before they closed, head nodding. "You're right, Frankie." She smiled, taking a seat next to him on the stage that was specially designed for the small musicians. "It's just—" she sighed, sweet chocolate eyes turning towards the window, where the faint sounds of protesters could be heard. Frankie was aware of them too, the protesters calling him and his band abominations. Keeping his cool, the frog scoffed at them, hopping onto the woman's shoulder to return her attention back to him. "Forget about 'em," he said. "They're probably rhythmless idiots who don't know the difference between a C-flat and a B natural." Franny chuckled. There is no difference. The frog winked. Doubt they know that. He hopped off her shoulder, dusting himself off. He snapped his finger and the rest of the frogs behind him immediately got into position. He handed the conducting stick back to the woman he would croak for, literally and figuratively. Ready, Toots? This time she let out laughter that reminded him of when she was a little girl, chasing after him and the others, proclaiming that she would teach them to sing. And even at their most primitive amphibian phase, when they were still croaking instead of scatting, he knew that this human was special. Franny bent down, kissing his clammy-like head before getting into position. Ready? She winked. And then the curtains rose. Showtime. Requiem of a timeline. Cornelius Robinson was late. Not that he intended to be, but he was. He had had a press luncheon with the mayor of Metroville about the building plans for a sector of Robinson industry being built in the city. The new building would be too complex to be made by insta-building materials and would require actual construction workers to complete the project, creating jobs. It would be a win-win situation, he had thought. His company would get to expand, and the city would be able to have more job opportunities since the project, once all the planning, negotiating, and actual building would take several years. By that point, he hoped, he would be able to figure out some way to give work to the ones that needed jobs once the construction was done. Sighing, Cornelius ran his hand through his always unruly blonde hair as the limo he took turned, heading towards Metroville Symphony Center. Looking out the window, he saw the streets were congested with traffic, though Todayland had already made the switch to hover cars and PBT, public bubble transportation, both of which were drastically cleaner for the environment. There were still cities such as Metroville that still used the land models of transportation. Soon, though, he thought, with the completion of Factory, and many others he hoped to have in other cities, the world would be a cleaner, happier, and safer place. However, he was risking a lot on this. Cornelius Robinson was no politician, but his whole plan was beginning to delve into political waters. Already there was a talk about him running for mayor of Todayland. Some even said his eyes were on the presidency. Rumors, both of them, but no one would deny that the Robinson inventor had influence. If he said he needed a new nuclear reactor, a new one would be placed on his front steps in a day. No expenses and no questions asked. And he had power, he would admit, though only to himself. However, with that power came responsibility that he could have never imagined as a boy, even after his son Wilbur had showed him the grandeur of the future. Cornelius chuckled bitterly to himself as he remembered when he, Orphan Lewis, had first set eyes on the future. Everything was bright and shiny, and everyone seemed happy and carefree. He wondered if it was just his childish ignorance, or if somewhere in his life he had taken the wrong step, made the wrong decision, because the reality of it was that despite how it was true that crime, violence, and hate had reached a record low, it didn't mean that they were non-existent. Actually, thinking about it, the deadly sins of humanity would never truly be gone. No matter how much he tried, they would hide always in the deepest crevices of life, away from humanity. Shaking his head from such troubling thoughts, the great inventor turned his attention to his watch. Franny was surely going to be upset with him now. Thinking of his beautiful, dark-haired wife, he shuddered at the damage she could cause when angered. This was a special performance she was putting on. It was a fundraiser she was having in order to promote the conservation of some of the world's swamps. But it was more than that. Not only were music lovers going to be at this concert, but scientists from all over the world. It had been over a decade since Franny had first debuted her singing frogs, and it had taken another few years to show the quantitative data that proved that not only could the frogs sing, but they could actually think and feel. It had started a wave of people attempting to get their cats and dogs to sing, but many gave up soon after the first years of failure. Though many were interested in the scientific theory behind the phenomenon, none had put in the heart and dedication as Franny had. She had spent literally her whole life teaching her frogs how to sing. No one had believed her at the beginning, and that had almost caused Franny to quit several times. But Cornelius believed in her, and that was enough for her. All she needed was an audience of one, as long as he was that one. So it was really bad that he was late. "Excuse me, Tony?" Cornelius called to his driver. The driver's eyes briefly flashed up the rearview mirror, signaling that his client had caught his attention. "How much further?" "Not too far, Mr. Robinson. We should be there in about 5 minutes." Cornelius sighed, trying to remember the order of music that was to be played. If he was correct, he'd arrive right before any of Franny's favorites started. She would be upset, but a bouquet of pink tulips her favorite, and honey flies, Frankie's favorite, would settle everything. Sir, says she is so. Here we are, Mr. Robinson," Tony said, bringing the inventor from his thought. They turned a corner and were supposed to be met with the front of the Metroville Symphony Center. However, the sight they saw was one Cornelius had been dreading. In front of the music hall was a large crowd of people protesting, shouting animal rights and reading laws against animal cruelty through a megaphone. Some signs even claimed that the frogs were an abomination. Knowing he'd only add more fuel to the fire if he stepped out now, Cornelius looked towards Tony. "Can you drive around to the back?" "Of course, Mr. Robinson. Already one step ahead of you, sir." It only took a few seconds to drive around to the back of the center. Apparently Cornelius wasn't the only with the idea to go around to the back, as he found a few other late stragglers coming in as well. As Tony opened the door to let him out, Cornelius was aware of the driver's tight grip on the door as the protesters' chanting grew louder. "I should be nearby, Mr. Robinson," he was told, "but if you plan to leave the concert early, contact me by the number I gave you." Nodding, Cornelius did one final check of his tux before entering the building. When he entered the main foyer, the usher at the door told him that he would have to wait till the current song was over. Knowing he couldn't just interrupt the concert, the inventor nodded, taking a seat at a nearby bench. He wasn't aware that someone had sat down next to him till she spoke. "You clean up well, Mr. Robinson." Startled, Cornelius jumped in his seat a little. He turned to see an older woman in a sparkling black ball gown with see-through sleeves. Snow-white hair was cut into a simple bob, while vibrant emerald eyes seemed to laugh at his startled reaction. Honestly, if it wasn't for the crow feet around her eyes, she could honestly be mistaken for someone much younger than she was. So it's someone... Thank you, ma'am," was all that Cornelius could say under the woman's penetrating stare. He shifted in his seat, wondering if he had something on his face. He was relieved when the music from within the concert hall swelled, Frankie's voice filtering out, giving Cornelius a distraction from the woman's stare. "What an extraordinary creature," the woman commented. "Never would I have thought frogs would have such beautiful voices." "Well, frogs are one of the most musically inclined animals, not including humans," Cornelius said almost automatically, after hearing Franny say it so for years. It was almost a well-known quote in the Robinson house, as his signature "keep moving forward." However, finding the right sequence of music genres the frogs will respond to can be an effort. It's very hit or miss. Much more complicated than inventing. "Is that so? Your family seems to have many interests in the unbelievable. It's commendable that you take time out of your busy schedule to support your wife," she said before getting up. Cornelius noticed that the audience had started to clap and that the usher had opened the door, signaling he could go in. When he turned back to do the gentlemanly thing and escort the mysterious woman in, she was gone. 9. Requiem of a timeline. Franny Robinson was on a high. The concert was a success, and members from the musical and scientific communities swarmed around her to congratulate her. Frankie was standing on a pedestal next to her, entertaining those who requested a closer look at the amphibian, as if getting closer would reveal some sort of microphone or hidden wires. Frankie wasn't very fond of being treated like a display item, but unbeknownst to many save for those of the Robinson clan, he was very protective of not only his band, but of Franny as well. He had been the first one she had found, the first one she had taught to sing, and the first one to actually sing for her. Only for her. If he had to be surrounded by a group of strangers, poked and prodded, then so be it. "Mrs. Robinson," a balding man came up to her, eagerly shaking Franny's hand. I must congratulate you on an excellent show. It was simply marvelous." The woman blushed slightly, taking in the praise modestly. "Thank you, sir, but I have to say, I wouldn't be here without Frankie. He's helped so much with the set list and even composed some of the songs." The man looked at her shocked, eyes drifting back and forth between the woman before him and the finely dressed frog, before he hollowed with laughter. Beauty and a sense of humor, he chuckled, not noticing Franny's smile becoming tight and forced, and Frankie's eyes narrowing. "Now, I must ask," he continued, "did your husband contribute to this showcase of talent, HM? Perhaps an invention that spliced human DNA with amphibian? That doesn't seem like a difficult achievement for the great Cornelius Robinson." "Actually, Mr. Marshall, all I did was give my wife the love and support to help her reach her goals." Cornelius spoke sagely, cutting across the room easily as people made a path for the renowned inventor. He stood next to Franny, taking a second to kiss her on the brow, before looking at the older man. "I can assure you that any other involvement on my part was non-existent and would appreciate if you would give my wife and Frankie credit where credit is due." Mr. Marshall cleared his throat, face red with embarrassment. "Yes, of course. Forgive me," he said before quickly walking away. Cornelius sighed, turning towards his wife, who looked anything but pleased. I could have handled that, Mr. Robinson." "Yes, of course you could, dear," he sighed. "And you were late." She frowned further, putting her hands on her hips. Cornelius couldn't help but to admire her still youthful figure underneath her slim, fitting navy dress. His thoughts didn't get much further when he felt a wet smack on the back of his head. He didn't have to turn around to know that it had been Frankie's tongue. The frog had a habit of being somewhat of a guardian for his wife, something he was grateful for but often irritated by. Knowing he would get nowhere far with arguing, Cornelius simply looked at her with regretful blue eyes. Whether he knew and was using it to his advantage or not, Franny's shoulders relaxed, and her frown turned into a soft smile. Knowing that he wasn't in the clear yet, he turned to Frankie. The frog merely shrugged, and before the inventor knew it, he was forgiven. "So what did you think?" Franny asked excitedly. Smiling, Cornelius told of his thoughts about the show, all of which praised his wife and her froggy friends. Frankie watched as Franny questioned her husband about every little detail, watching as she blushed when Cornelius told her how beautiful she looked up on stage in a dress Frankie had helped her pick. Readjusting his tie, he looked away, giving the two their privacy. Franny was happy with the nerd. That was enough for him. "Sweetheart, there's a few more people I want to talk to," Franny said. "You should go back to the hotel. You look exhausted." The idea of relaxing at the hotel was appealing to him, but the still present buzz of the protesters had not waned. Already aware of what he was thinking, Franny rolled her eyes, pushing him in the direction of the back exit. "I'll be fine," she whispered, before softly kissing him. That was all it took to have Cornelius Robinson walk back towards his limo with a skip in his step. The feeling didn't last long, when inside he had two familiar green eyes staring back at him smugly. Before he could get a word out, she tossed a file at him. "I'm afraid I didn't introduce myself." She smiled pleasantly. "My name is Mirage, Mr. Robinson, and the government is in need of your talents." Chapter 6. The blueprint. He read the file. Then he reread it again. And just for the heck of it, he read it a third time. "Mr. Robinson, I doubt any of the information in that file will change by rereading it." Blue eyes connected with green. This is incredible." "The Incredibles," Mirage corrected with a grin. "We've been watching you, Mr. Robinson. You and many others since we put our supers in storage, so to speak. Though you had been initially put on the list of scientists to do maintenance work on the capsules in another 15 years, we've come to a bit of a problem that requires we awaken the Incredibles immediately." Cornelius frowned. The file had given him the background story. In 2007, the same year he had his future voyage with Wilbur the Incredibles, and dozens of other supers had agreed to be put into a frozen sleep after their public identities were shown to the public. Though it was an extreme response, The government officials at that time were afraid of starting a civil war between supers and non-supers. The supers who could potentially be a threat, if provoked enough, were strongly encouraged to participate or be faced with another option that may or may not have been as favorable. Cornelius wasn't sure. There were no details in the file about the second option. The sleeping supers were held in facilities all throughout the U.S., and some in other countries, though. Of course, the locations hadn't been listed for security reasons in the file. The capsules had enough energy to house the ones inside for several hundreds of years, though the government had planned to resurrect them after at least 70 years, if the political atmosphere towards them didn't lighten up before that. Putting aside the fact that the government had been holding back this kind of information and technology, made Cornelius wonder what else they had come up with that the public didn't know. But it also made him question why exactly he was needed. This woman, Mirage, had just said that he had been initially on the list for a future maintenance crew. However, it was obvious that was no longer the situation currently. Closing the file and placing it in the seat next to him, he asked calmly, "What would you like me to do?" Mirage chuckled. "I see I piqued your interest. Well, as of right now, we're currently being driven to the location of the NSA safety hideout where the Incredibles are located." Reaching down, she picked up a silver briefcase before opening it on her lap. From the case, she passed him another file. Though the capsules are able to have enough energy for over a century, there was an unfortunate breach in security. One of our agents turned rogue, attacking the capsules after the Incredibles had entered. Thankfully, the agent didn't know much about the capsule's structures, so no harm came to them. Unfortunately, we didn't necessarily come out of the situation unscathed, she said, pointing to her right eye. Now that it was pointed out to him, he noticed that the right eye was slightly duller and unfocused compared to the left. A custom-made contact was probably designed to give the appearance that both eyes were fine, despite her only probably being able to see out of one eye. Mirage leaned over to pat his knee. "I've gotten used to it, Mr. Robinson. No use crying over spilt milk. As I was saying, we were attacked. What you need to know about people in my line of work, especially supers, is that a lot of things have to be done quickly. On instincts, you could say. I believe you'll understand what I mean when you see for yourself." "Ah, we're here." The limo stopped, and getting out, Cornelius was not all that surprised to see that they were at what appeared to be an abandoned shack. He doubted it would be a good idea to have a high-tech secret building housing people with great power on view to everyone. Mirage led the way, seemingly not bothered with wearing heels on a rocky slope that led to the decrepit shack. With a little difficulty, Cornelius managed to catch up with her. Slightly embarrassed that he had been shown up by someone older than him, he was well aware that perhaps she worked out, keeping her body in better shape than the poor inventor. When she was sure he was caught up, Mirage placed her hand on what appeared to be a broken plank besides the door. His eyebrow rose when a not-at-all old-looking keypad popped out. Pressing a few codes, Mirage leaned forward towards the keypad. Mirage and guest. Stepping back, she watched amused as Cornelius's eyes lit up at the sight of the shack's appearance, as it flickered before turning into a sleek and clean doorway that led underground. "Ontsa, Mr. Robinson, welcome to the rabbit hole." Requiem of a timeline. Blowing on his lukewarm drink, small ice crystals began to form along the glass as he watched the busy hustle and flow of agents checking machines and energy levels. Seasoned eyes watched the activity like a hawk, making sure that nothing went wrong this time. The days of being a super was over for Lucius Best. He had retired in front of the public, giving his super suit to the then current mayor of Metroville. The anti-super protesters had gotten a super to step down, and he had received a bullet in the back, paralyzing him from the waist down. More than a fair trade-off, he thought bitterly, toying with his wedding ring before placing it back in his pocket and glaring at the black band on his finger that had replaced it. The sound of the elevator took him from his thoughts, alerting him that Mirage had finally arrived with their guest. Turning his wheelchair around, Lucius waited to be introduced. "Lena, Mr. Robinson, I'd like to introduce you to Lucius Best, formerly known as Frozone, and the NSA's best liaison between supers and the public, as well as being a close personal friend to the Incredibles. Lucius, this is Cornelius Robinson, the man claimed to be the smartest man in the world. Lucius chuckled, placing his glass down on a nearby table and shaking the man's hand. Cornelius chuckled as well, hiding the grimace as he felt like ice daggers were going up his arm at the man's touch. I wouldn't say smartest. I just make a lot of mistakes and learn from them, the investor said, modestly relieved, when his hand was set free and circulation began to flow again. Well, Lucius motioned for Mirage and Cornelius to follow him. I hoped you learned enough on how to not make mistakes, because I doubt they can afford any more. Looking up from the wheelchair-bound man, the inventor's mouth dropped slightly at the sight of 5 sleek-looking capsules. Each had a display that seemed to read dangerously low energy levels, but that wasn't what caught his eyes. Each capsule had a small window, showing the face of the person inside. Cornelius didn't know what he was more shocked over, the fact that there really were people inside the capsules, or the fact that these peoples, supers, men and women who in their highest points of their careers saved cities and the world countless times, looked so normal. Looking at the last capsule, he saw a girl that couldn't be any older than his son, and 2 other children who were even younger. So, can you do it? Lucius asked expectantly. Well, Cornelius said, placing a hand under his chin, thinking, it seems that most of the system's functions have gone into an energy-safe mood. Narrowing his eyes, he tried to see better before taking a step forward. Wait, Mirage warned, but it was too late. Cornelius took a step further, crossing over a white line that had been placed there a few days earlier, marking a boundary. Unaware of this, Cornelius was shocked when he ran into something hard. Taking a step back and readjusting his glasses, he saw nothing. What the? This is why we need you. Mirage stepped next to him, placing her hand in front of her. From where her hand was held up, he saw a faint purple outline. Looking towards him, she explained further. I told you that when the Incredibles were placed inside their capsules, we were attacked by a rogue agent. If you also remember, I mentioned how in the line of work of supers, instincts are important. She tapped a finger on the Ray's hand, creating a sound that reminded Cornelius of the bouncing pads outside his home. This is being caused by one of them? Cornelius looked around the area, not really seeing anything but faintly aware of a buzz that went through him as he placed his hand on a hard, invisible surface in front of him. This is amazing! Directing his attention towards his 2 guides, he asked, which one is doing this? I mean, if I remember correctly, they all had different powers. Violet. Lucius pointed towards the girl who looked Wilbur's age. She was the last one in. Apparently the sedative hadn't fully worked itself through her systems yet when we were attacked. If she hadn't put this force field up, though the capsules themselves wouldn't have been damaged, some of the more delicate instruments would have been beyond repair, and the whole project dead, along with the family. Amazing, Cornelius said in awe before his brow furrowed. But if what you're saying is true, this force field has been up for what, over 30 years? He exclaimed. Mirage nodded, crossing her arms. Exactly, Mr. Robinson, which is where you come in. As I'm sure you have seen, the monitors on the capsules are draining. Usually, with a power such as Violet's, it depends on her energy level, whether she had enough food or sleep, etc. But being turned into a human popsicle, there's not really that many chances for you to go out and get a burger, Lucius joked. So instead, she's found another source to keep up the force field. The energy being used to power the capsules is being drained at a faster rate than designed because of her, concluded Cornelius. But nothing can be done to rectify that till the force field is gone. My, Mirage smiled, pleased. I believe we chose the right man after all. Think you're up to the challenge, Robinson? Lucius questioned. Cornelius sighed tiredly, running his hand through his hair. Looking back at Violet, he saw his son's face and felt some compassion for the girl and her family that he didn't know, beyond a few newspaper articles and secret files. I'll be owing Franny more than a few tulips, he sighed. Both of Mirage and Lucius were pleased knowing that this was his acceptance. Lucius was the first to speak. I think we can help you with that. Chapter 7. The Revival. For a moment, Lucius wondered if the inventor before him had lost his mind. Cornelius was throwing item after item at the force field with the same result. Nothing. Up above in an observation deck, Mirage and Lucius observed the inventor. "Are you sure he's the one?" Lucius asked. "We still have time. If we go look for a new inventor, if we go look for someone else, then they won't be as dedicated as he is," Mirage commented coolly. "Trust me when I say that he's the one," Lucius snorted, rolling his eyes. "Woman's intuition." Mirage turned away from the window, walking back to her office. There was a lot of paperwork that needed her attention at the moment. "Something like that," she stated before leaving the room in an annoyed Lucius. Back down below, Cornelius was still at odds with himself. There had to be something he was missing. Papers, chalkboards, and the wall were covered with equations, but nothing stood out. Placing his head in his hands, he leaned against the wall, letting himself slide down to the floor. He wondered if he could actually do this. He had been provided every tool possible, access to top-secret experiments that he had never imagined before, and yet he still was no closer to a solution. He looked at the girl who was the source of his dilemma. For some reason, he still couldn't get over how young she and her siblings were. Of course, any teenager would argue that they weren't children anymore, but every time he looked at her, he saw Wilbur, and that caused his heartstrings to tug because of how her life must have been as a super. Cornelius wasn't oblivious to what his own son had to face as a Robinson. "You love your family a lot, don't you?" he asked her, though he knew he wasn't going to get a response. He wondered if she could hear him, though she was supposed to be asleep. Unlike the rest of her family, her eyes were still opened, pupils gone with her entire eyes glowing a light purple. "Psst, you did a good thing protecting your family," he continued, getting up and dusting himself off. "Family is important to me too, especially since I never really get one till I was 12. Being an orphan and all." He went over to the work table that had been set up on the other side of the wall. Cornelius decided to keep talking. It helped clear his mind, and from past experience he never worked well on an invention if his mind was already preoccupied with other things. "My parents are great, though. You honestly would never know that we weren't related unless you asked." "Ugh, this calculation is all wrong," he said, rewriting the formula before continuing. "They loved and guided me as if I had been with them all my life. I feel that without them I wouldn't be where I am now. Well, that and my son time-traveling to the past, but that's a completely different thing." Tapping his finger on his chin, he thought of something. The force field is utilizing the potential energy of the capsules. Searching around the table, he found it. A small piece of magnet he had broken off of some device hours ago. "Maybe this will work," he murmured before tossing it at the force field. He was relieved to see the magnet suspend in the air for a brief moment before dropping. It is magnetic. Then that means, fingers already stretching out for parts, Cornelius couldn't help but continue on with his previous one-sided conversation. "My son Wilbur is about your age, Violet. I don't know about you, but he has his mother's stubbornness and charm, and well, I guess he has my stubbornness too." He laughed. "His birthday will be coming up in a month or two. I honestly don't know what he wants. I don't even really know what he does anymore, to be honest. There used to be times when I couldn't even get him out of at-home lab. Now I barely see him." "Aha!" In his hands he held a small device that had 2 prongs at the top. "I can't believe I didn't think about this earlier." He shook his head. It would be almost impossible to try and destroy it, when it would be so much simpler to just weaken it. Holding his breath, and hoping that he wouldn't end up with a cloud of smoke in his face, Cornelius pressed the correct sequence into the device and hoped for the best. At first it seemed like nothing happened. However, ever so subtly, there was a disturbance in the air around him. The hair on his neck began to stand up. The lights above began to flicker, and Cornelius Robinson stared amazed as a hole began to form on the surface of the force field. Above. Lucius was in Schausil. "I can't believe it," Lucius murmured, placing his hands against the glass to get a better view. Remembering exactly what Cornelius was doing, Lucius rolled himself over to an intercom, pressing the button for Mirage's office. He did it! Requiem of a timeline. Johnny had left her at the party, probably to go chase that girl he had been ogling at all throughout the party. Snorting in disdain, Samantha walked further down the street of Todayland's Midnight District, called that because most of the activities that happened there started around midnight, when some of the more respectable members of the city were tucked away in their beds. It was the equivalent of any other city's red light district, but of course, being Todayland, this knowledge was by word of mouth only. There were no flashy neon signs stating where the love hotels were, the party houses, bars, or strip clubs. You just knew. Tugging her sweater closer around her, Samantha checked her watch. It was an hour or two before dawn. By this time, people were either passed out drunk inside the establishments of the Midnight District, or they had already headed home. Mentally cursing her unfaithful boyfriend, she wished she hadn't had decided to wear such uncomfortable shoes. It was because she had stopped to take off her shoes that she was grabbed around the waist, face shoved hard against the wall of an alley. She whimpered as she felt large hands grope her body, a broad chest pressed against her back. She didn't dare to make a sound for fear of the cold metal that was being pressed against her temple. She felt the hand going up her skirt, and tears forming at her eyes. This would have never happened if Johnny had just driven her back home. However, just as the hand of the stranger was just about to reach the juncture between her legs, Samantha felt the brute being harshly torn away from her. She spun around just in time to see her attacker fall to the ground, brutally beaten, a hooded figure hidden mostly by the shadows looking down at the creep. Gathering her wits, she held back a hysterical scream once again, instead asking, "Who are you?" Her protector took a step back, deeper into the shadows, hiding what little features she could see in this darkened space. He had disappeared, but she had sworn she had heard him chuckle, saying something before he was gone. That is an excellent question. Requiem of a timeline. Tired, drained, cold, dark. These were the only things she could think about, if you called it thinking. It was more of an animalistic instinct than actual realization. She didn't know where she was or what was happening. She heard noise but was unable to really focus on it. Complex thought was out of her range at the moment. She was just tired, drained, and cold. It continued like that for a while, somewhat aware that something was happening around her, but not being able to piece together what. It took a while for her to realize that the buzzing in her head were her thoughts, that the slight pricking feeling was coming from her hand, that her body was shaken, and that her body wasn't responding to her. It took her even longer to open her eyes, blinking back as tear prickled her eyes at the brightness. When that cleared, her eyes saw white, a ceiling. Able to turn her head slightly, she saw white walls and machines. She was on a bed. A few minutes later, she was able to piece together she was in some sort of hospital room. However, her brain was working slowly to explain how and why she was there. You're awake. White hair, green eyes, tanned skin. Mirage, she tried to say, but it sounded more like an exhale of air. The woman nodded. How are you feeling, Violet? Violet! That was her name, and with the remembrance of her name came the sudden tidal wave of memories, all too much for her to handle. So she returned to the embracing darkness, blacking out. Requiem of a timeline. Samantha was having a rough day at her receptionist job at Robinson Industries. Mr. Robinson hadn't returned from his trip to Metroville. The only thing keeping the whole company from going into a complete panic was that his wife, Franny Robinson, had called, saying he had stayed back in Metroville for a little longer to discuss the expansion project more to city leaders. This would have been all fine and dandy if it wasn't for the fact that now Samantha and one or two other of her co-workers had to reschedule some of the appointments he had planned for this week, which was never easy when the other party had been waiting months for this meeting. As well as all the rescheduling work, Samantha was still slightly shaken by what happened to her earlier this morning. Her co-workers were used to seeing her come in looking like one of the living dead, all of them with their suspicions that she spent time in the Midnight District. Though it wasn't necessarily illegal to go there, it was an almost taboo topic. It was because of this that no one bothered to ask if she was okay or not. As long as she got the work done properly and on time, It wasn't their business to question what she did on her spare time. Jumping slightly when the phone on her desk rang, she picked it up, answering it. "Hello, Robinson Industries. This is Samantha speaking. How may I help you?" "Yes." The voice on the line, a man, answered. "I would like to speak with Mr. Robinson." "I'm sorry, sir, but Mr. Robinson isn't available right now, and won't be for the entire week. If you like, I could schedule you an appointment," she said, flipping through her planner. "But it wouldn't be able to happen for another 4 months. I have no intention of waiting that long," the man stated, making Samantha roll her eyes. "If it's possible, may I leave him a message and my contact information?" "Of course, sir, but I can't guarantee when he'll be able to get back to you." "Oh, I don't doubt he won't get back to me as quickly as possible with the risk of a lawsuit hanging over his head." Excuse me?" Samantha sputtered. "Just let him know that the Public Concerns Council will be making a visit, and his cooperation will save his company from getting into messy legal issues." Looking at the phone, Samantha frowned. "Is this a joke, sir?" "On the contrary, miss. This is only the beginning." Chapter 8. Adjustments. She was finally able to sit up in her bed without the assistance of someone else. That had taken 3 days. It had taken another day for her to be able to hold down solid foods, though currently her stomach would only settle for the blandest of the bland. Closing her eyes, Violet took a deep breath. Her head hurt, and her whole body seemed to shake, though the doctors had told her it was just a side effect of being taken out of the capsule and would be gone in a week's time. Opening closed eyes, she turned back to Lucius, who was waiting patiently by her bed. She still couldn't get used to the sight of him in a wheelchair, nor could she ask how it happened or how his life was currently outside of his position at the NSA. So, will they be okay?" she asked, running her fingers through her hair. A nervous habit. Lucius sighed, scratching the back of his head, unsure of how to answer. "They'll be okay," he told her slowly. "However, unlike you who were in a semi-conscious state in order to keep the force field up, the preparations to take them out will be longer, followed by a slightly longer recovery period than you had to go through." Biting her lip, Violet wondered if she should ask the question that was playing on her mind. Tilting her head forward and causing her hair to create a curtain around her face, she asked quietly, "I almost killed them, didn't I?" At a loss of what to say, Lucius shook his head. "You did what you had to do. You didn't know that your powers would mature like that. Shoot, man! I doubt you even knew what you were doing." Leaning as far as he could in his chair, he moved her hair out of her face. "You saved the lives of your family. You are a hero." He squeezed her shoulder before pulling back and rolling out the room, letting the girl have her space. Violet didn't look up from her folded hands in her lap, even when she was alone. Her gaze focused on the black band-like ring on her finger. Lucius had one too, and sometimes he could be caught staring at Inyan when he thought no one was looking. Not much was explained, but what she did know was that as a super, she had to wear the ring all the time, in order to be in accordance with government laws. Somewhere in the back of her head, it reminded her of bright yellow stars sewn onto clothing that she had read about in her history textbook so many years ago. Wishing that there were windows in her room, Violet wanted to know how much the outside world had changed in over 30 years. It was an odd thought, since it felt like 30 years ago was just the other day. She wondered if she would be able to fit in, or if it would be painfully obvious that she didn't belong. Am I even going to school? She wondered. She rubbed her temples, feeling a headache coming on. I see you're doing better." Turning her head so quickly made her dizzy, so it took her a few seconds before she could look clearly at her visitor. At first, she had trouble remembering him. "I'm Cornelius Robinson." The man chuckled, obviously aware that she was having trouble recognizing him. "We were briefly introduced earlier." Violet blushed out of embarrassment, gripping her arms self-consciously at the presence of this almost stranger. Cornelius waited to see if she would speak before he continued. "I honestly don't know what you're feeling," he began. "But even when things get tough, you shouldn't just constantly look back. I mean, don't forget about your past, but keep moving forward." Stepping forward, he handed her what looked like a photo album. "I knew that it might be weird not knowing what was going on in the world, So I put newspaper articles and such in there that I thought you either should know or might be interested to know. A small smile appeared on Violet's face at the man's kindness. Thank you. Mr. Robinson nodded before saying his farewells and leaving, knowing that there was nothing else to do and that it would be nice to know something about the world now. Violet opened her gift, taking in all of her new world. Requiem of a timeline. After leaving the room with the young recovering super, he headed to find Mirage. He had to ask once or twice, but Cornelius finally found the room that Mirage had directed him to go to. He knocked twice before opening the door. Inside was a dark room, with one single light hanging over a bare metal table and chair. Standing next to the table, waiting for him, was Mirage. "Mr. Robinson," she greeted. "Please, take a seat." Cornelius did so, although, be it hesitantly. He watched as Mirage looked at her watch. Mouth frowned worriedly. It surprised the man. Though he didn't know her for long, and hardly knew anything other than her name, he knew that she wasn't a woman to be easily fretted. "Tsurtsi, I and the NSA would like to thank you for your help with recovering the Incredibles. Of course, your efforts won't go unnoticed. A few billion of dollars will be wired to your account in thanks. Give it to a charity." Cornelius waved off. "I honestly don't need it, but I appreciate the offer." He looked at her questioningly, as kept looking at her watch, and then briefly glanced up towards a security camera. "Is there something wrong?" Mirage, startled by his question, regained her wits, reaching up and pulling down an odd-looking device with what looked like a plunger attached. "I'm perfectly fine, Mr. Robinson," she said, directing the red pinpoint light in the center of his forehead. "Now just relax." Cornelius looked at the machine she was operating, recognizing it. He wouldn't remember any of this, which was probably for the safety of the NSA and the Incredibles. He calmly took off his glasses and placed them in his shirt pocket. Mirage watched the man. He knew what she was about to do and was silently agreeing to it. Yes, he would do. She pressed a button on the machine, but instead of having the plunger fly straight towards Mr. Robinson's head, the red light on the security camera went off. Seeing his confusion as she raised the memory machine back up to its original position, Mirage held up a hand, silencing him. She took a breath, her face relaxing a bit. "Cornelius," she said, as he put on his glasses, startled somewhat by the informal use of his name. "Cornelius," she repeated. "I'm afraid I have to ask you for one more favor, though. This time, it's not on the behalf of the NSA. It is of my own request." Nodding, intrigued, Cornelius motioned to go on. "I'm listening." Requiem of a timeline. She remembered when she was little that she had a pop-up book. She couldn't remember the name of the story, or the plot at all, but she did remember that the colorful pages had captivated her young mind as she made the cardboard figures on the page move by pulling a tab. Now, the book she was currently holding put the memory of her pop-up book to shame. Pictures as vibrant as grass, fresh after the rain, hovered over the pages, actually moving in time to the words on the page as she read. Wide, indigo eyes watched as images of flying cars and humanoid thinking robots danced literally before her eyes. Turning the page, she saw how Canada became North Montana in the Declaration of Beer and Maple Leaf, how in 2018 Franny Robinson debuted her band of singing frogs, and how in 2020 Cornelius Robinson was claimed to be the father of the future after creating an invention that fixed the ozone layer and filtered the air around big cities. Turning page after page, Violet felt her mind filling with information. She was never really a history buff, but to her, this didn't seem like history. It was like something straight out of a science fiction book, though it wasn't fiction at all. Not in this time. Over the next few weeks, after her physical therapy to regain muscle memory, Violet would read the book for hours. The book would hum every time she got to the last page, reopening itself back to the first page, where something totally new and different than what was there originally would be waiting for her to read. The book was a good distraction from the fact that she hadn't been able to see her family at all. She had been told that their process of recovery would vary due to their different metabolisms and powers. Once they had awakened, someone would definitely notify Violet. This did nothing to calm her worries and her fears. Setting aside her book, she concentrated on going invisible. Opening her eyes, she sighed disappointedly when she could still see herself. Her powers had been almost non-existent for the last few days. Sometimes she could get purple sparks to play at her fingertips before diminishing just as soon as they came. The doctor said it was probably because being frozen had not only put a strain on her physical body, but also her powers, along with the fact that she had been keeping up a force field for over 3 decades. She still couldn't wrap her mind around that. Violet remembered when her family began their work as the Inquartables, the NSA had put each of them through endurance tests to see their strengths and weaknesses. These tests were done routinely over a fixed period of time. The first time she was tested, when she was 14, Violet was only able to hold her force field up at full strength for a total of 1.3 minutes. With a circumference of 5.8 feet, that would be long enough to withstand basic guns and small explosions, but anything that had any real weight or power to it would crack her shields instantaneously. With a lot of practice and concentration, by the time she was almost 17, she had been able to hold her force field up full strength for 20 minutes with a circumference of 12 feet and able to withstand short-ranged missiles. However, compared to the length and time that Violet held up her last force field, was even beyond the predictive calculations that were expected of her. 45 minutes with a circumference of 15 feet and able to withstand long-range missiles. Pushing away thoughts of powers and her futuristic present, Violet got up slowly to go to the bathroom, hoping that maybe a shower would make this feeling of unease that was bubbling in her stomach go away. Night's Requiem of a timeline. I told you last time, Robinson, it's $350 or nothing. We both know it ain't cheap or legal to be selling this. Wilbur Robinson rolled his eyes, scooting forward in his chair so he could be heard over the pounding music of one of the Midnight District's best clubs. Flashing black lights made Wilbur's face more sharp and defined as he said, "Then you shouldn't be selling it, Hank. Don't give me crap for your own mistakes in life. I don't have time to listen to it." A deep scowl set on his face. Hank leaned forward so that his mouth was a hairbreadth away from the boy's ear. If it wasn't for some punk's rich daddy creating non-human operated transportation, I would have been able to keep my job as a taxi driver. Rolling his eyes again, Wilbur leaned back in his chair. "My good man, there are plenty of level 2 cities that are still using land gas using transportation. Why not just go there? It's the principle, damn it." Hank snapped before slapping his big, meaty hand against his dark, bearded face. Taking a deep breath, Hank removed his hand, staring steadily at the young man across from him. $350 per case or nada, Robinson. Knowing when to push others' buttons and when not to, Wilbur reached into the coat pocket of his favorite black leather jacket and tossed thick wad of cash at the table. "No credit?" Hank teased. "You know this can't be traced," Wilbur said, taking the 2 small brown paper-wrapped packages that Hank had placed on the table. Getting up and about to leave the table, Wilbur stopped when he felt Hank's large hand grip his shoulder tightly. "Don't know what you got yourself into, Robinson," the older man said gruffly. "But here's a word of advice. If I was you, I'd tell old Daddy that he better stop ending jobs for people. Word on the street is that some folks have had enough. Wouldn't want your pretty face messed up if you get on their bad side." And with that, Hank pushed him forward, a hollow laughter heard over the music until Wilbur found himself outside. Brows furrowed in thought, Wilbur lifted the hood of the hoodie he wore underneath his jacket. Though the club had been dark enough for no one to really pay attention or care to the young Robinson, the streets were full of eyes wanting something from his family, good and or bad. Walking towards the parked hover car lot, his dark brown eyes scanned the lot till he saw one hover car that's headlights flashed on off once. Once he was inside the vehicle, he tossed without looking one of the packages to the person sitting in the passenger seat next to him. "You seem tense." Snorting, Wilbur turned towards his company. Long, straight auburn hair was pulled beneath a dark gray beret, framing delicate feminine features on porcelain white skin. Beneath a dark trench coat, Wilbur knew there were well-made hand-stitched clothes that hadn't even hit the runway yet. "I'm fine, Adrian," he said, releasing his tight grip on the wheel. Not believing him, a perfectly arched brow raised questioningly. However, when seeing that Wilbur wasn't going to delve any further into the subject, Adrian merely shrugged. Long, slender fingers began to open the package, revealing a clear case of over a dozen injection needles. Taking one, needle met flesh as Adrian injected the clear liquid into herself. Sighing contently, hazel eyes closed in pleasure as warmth coursed through her veins. "You know this stuff is bad for you," Wilbur said, turning the ignition on and waiting as the car slowly lifted into the air. Adrian laughed, a hoarse laugh filling the car. "It is for you, too. So are the cigarettes I've been having to share with you lately. Thought you quit when Carl caught you 2 months ago." "I did, and I have. Not according to the smell clinging to your clothes, love," Adrian said, picking at his clothes. "Why don't you change at my place, yeah? Stay if you want. Your mother loves me, so it should be okay." Sighing, Wilbur nodded. "Yeah, that's fine. I think I'll do that," he said tiredly. "Thanks. You're the best." Adrian hummed contently, eyes closed as Wilbur steered the hovercar towards her apartment in downtown Todayland. "I know, love. I know." Requiem of a timeline. Violet had taken a shower to clear her mind. However, when she had stepped back into her room, wrapped in a bathrobe that was somewhat itchy, she knew that things wouldn't be that simple. The feeling didn't seem to go away, even after she had changed into the gray shirt and pants that she had been given. Thinking that she should get back to reading, she was slightly caught off guard when she heard a sudden knock at her door. Opening it, she was slightly surprised to see Mirage and Mr. Robinson at her door. "Violet," Mirage smiled. "Would you like to go for a ride?" Chapter 9. Growing Pains. She remembered that before her family had become the Incredibles, she had always been afraid of people thinking that she was a freak. On the cusp of womanhood, she already had enough to deal with things like zits, or the depressing fact that she would never really come close to the head-turning figure her mother had in her younger years, because life seemed to bless her with the curvaceous body of a stick. If she ever wrote an autobiography on herself, which would never be the case, since even retired supers had to keep their identities a secret the most, because it was only to be expected that they would have the most number of enemies. 3/4 of it would be filled with tales of struggles, with not only growing through the awkward phase that was adolescence, but also adding on the always complicated tidbit of being a teenage super that never failed in making one of her many clumsy memories 10 times more horrific than it would be under any other normal situation. It wasn't until she was allowed to use her powers as an outlet, to train them and let them grow, did she stop seeing herself as a freak. She was different just like everyone else in the world. Of course, though, with growing up, when one is not worried about peer pressure and views, the next hurdle to tackle would be independence, something Violet found she was still struggling to obtain as she stood behind Mirage and Lucius, the two sitting across from Cornelius Robinson. In all honesty, even if she were presented with the Declaration of Independence, Violet wouldn't know what to do, feeling the ice-cold tension that literally rolled off of Lucius, dropping the room temperature down several degrees as he stewed in below-freezing displeasure, made Violet feel very much a child. No, she thought. No to chilled. A slave. Unsure indigo eyes watched as the blonde inventor placed a large silver briefcase on the polished conference table. If Cornelius was even aware of the icy glare directed his way, he expertly ignored it, instead focusing his attention on Mirage, who sat with her hands folded before her, a subtle smirk on her lips. "I believe this is a reasonable amount," Mr. Robinson said, waving his hand at the briefcase. Mirage nodded. "Of course, Mr. Robinson. The transaction will be complete once you sign the NSA-required contract, basically stating that Violet Parr, aka Invisigirl, is now under your supervision, and thus under your responsibility. If anything should happen to her, it is of your consequence. The NSA will step in if it is needed." "This isn't right," Lucius muttered, but the other two chose to ignore him. Violet wanted to agree with him, but she felt dazed, her mouth seemingly not wanting to work. Her costume that always felt like a second skin to her felt tight and uncomfortable, and she hadn't been given her mask. She felt exposed. It was getting increasingly hard to breathe. She wondered if this was how a panic attack felt. No one seemed to notice. Cornelius took the offered contract and signed it. Mirage smiled, like the cat that caught the mouse. Waving towards Violet as she got up, getting behind a still seething Lucius to roll him out, she said, "Enjoy the new addition to your security team, Mr. Robinson." And with that, Mirage and Lucius were gone, the only familiars in this strange place. She hardly noticed Mirage slipping the inventor a black disc before exiting the room. Violet felt her legs finally give up underneath her as she began to collapse. However, Cornelius managed to catch the young super. "It's all right," he said soothingly, brushing her hair out of her face. She didn't even know she had been crying until Cornelius pulled out a handkerchief for her to wipe the tears that were streaming down her face. I don't understand," she wailed with grief. Sighing, Cornelius removed his glasses. "It's not the ideal way," he answered, "but it's your only chance at freedom." She snorted, rolling her eyes. Something inside her told her that he was truly trying to comfort her, but irrationality of youth wouldn't let the biting sarcasm escape an opportunity. Oh yes, like basically being sold like a slave is any better. Again, sighing, Cornelius ran his hand tiredly through his hair, Violet never remembering seeing wrinkles on the man's face. But suddenly the man seemed so much older than what she knew him to be. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but then he pulled out the disc that Mirage had given him from his pocket. "This'll explain everything. Requiem of a timeline." Was it strange to miss someone who wasn't technically gone? Wilbur thought so. People change. He was a prime example of that. Sure, around his family and at school he was Wilbur Robinson, the lovable handful of a charmer with a wild imagination and a knack for getting himself into crazy situations. But obviously, with a brooding expression on his face, as he leaned against the frame of the window outlooking the dawn-highlighted view that only Todayland could boast about. Thanks to the world's first purified air system, Wilbur had come a long way from his mischievous childhood. He regrets it slightly, but the world has a twisted sense of humor when it came to the lives that inhabited the earth, the young Robinson included. Sighing, causing the window to fog slightly, he traced initials with his finger before the fog faded completely. It read, "WV forever. Stop thinking about her." A voice startled him. Looking over his shoulder, he saw Adrian standing behind him, wearing a thin nightgown that stopped just above the knees. An exasperated look played on his friend's features. Thin arms crossed over a flat chest. "She's not coming back. You know that. I know that. We all know that. Move on, love." Wilbur shook his head. "I have, but that doesn't mean I can't look back on the memories I had with her," he said before turning back to the window, leaning his arm against the glass before placing his head on it. A cool hand was placed on his cheek, and he turned to look into Adrian's eyes before he was being pulled by his ear back to the guest room that he had been having a hard time going to sleep in. With a strength that was not obvious with such a willowy body, Adrian tossed the young man onto his bed, eyes burning dangerously, daring Wilbur to get up from the bed. Wilbur watched silently as Adrian stalked back to the other bedroom. There was a reason that his mother allowed him to stay at Adrian's apartment on short notices. No one other than Franny Robinson could instill the chill of cold fear in him, like Adrian Posner. The two had known each other for years, meeting a little after his adventure with Lewis. Their meeting was an interesting one. Adrian had changed a lot since those days as well. He chuckled humorlessly. Sighing, defeated, he reached into the pockets of the sweats that his friend always kept on hand for him here, taking out a small circular disc. Pressing his thumb against the surface, a holographic screen appeared. On it was the entire grid of the city with dots, some green, some yellow sprinkled throughout. However, his eyes focused on the only red dot on the screen, a robbery in the Moonlight District. Brown eyes drifting back to the door of the room, hesitant of moving from his bed before scoffing. Adrian didn't scare him. Gulping, he knew that was a lie. However, that didn't stop Adrian from finding an empty bed early the next morning. Wilbur long gone, his friend muttering something or the other about choking on the silly cape, before returning back to bed. Requiem of a timeline. Violet, let me first begin with saying that I am truly sorry. You may feel like this was a betrayal of the trust that your family has placed in me, but I do have you and your family's well-being in mind. I just hope that one day you can forgive me. The NSA has changed greatly since the death of Agent Dicker, years ago. Not everyone in this organization has the better interest of the supers, who weren't placed asleep in mind, including the new head of the NSA, Mr. X. Not much information is known about this man. Even I have never seen his face. What is known is that ever since he has taken over, the remaining active supers have been hired out as mercenaries, bodyguards, etc. Though this is illegal, no one has stopped him because of the security measures he has placed on the supers. If you look down at your hand right now, you'll see one. Dark eyes looked down at the black ring-like band Lucius had given her once she had first woken up. She never really questioned it, just simply put it on. Naivete would kill you in this business, but she didn't think she needed to question Lucius. He was family. It's called a power inhibitor. It decreases the strength of your power via a remote that is in the possession of your contractor. This is where Mr. Robinson's cooperation comes into play. Violet, this world is undoubtedly strange and unfamiliar to you, but if there is one thing you can believe in, it's the Robinsons. I'll contact you as soon as the first member of your family wakes up. Until then, keep a low profile, stay well, and good luck. This message will detonate in 10 seconds. Violet turned from the small screen that housed the recorded image of Mirage as it began to smoke. Tossing it in a nearby garbage can, she looked around her new surroundings. Mr. Robinson had driven her from his company to his home and placing her in the newly renovated guest house before she had played the message Mirage had left her. The two had avoided the main house altogether, though the inventor had promised to introduce everyone to her tomorrow before bidding her a good night. She was surprised when she first stepped into the room. Despite her name, Violet's favorite color was actually turquoise, so it was shocking when she saw that the room was decorated with said favorite color. She wondered if Mirage had something to do with that. The room was lively, and even Violet couldn't help let out a small smile as her gaze traveled across the decor. It was somewhat reminiscent of her old room, but not. Frowning, she pulled her hand away from the soft fabric of the curtain she had been feeling. This was only temporary. Only until she was reunited with her family. Then together, they would all move on from there. Until then, she was at the mercy of the Robinsons' kindness. This isn't home, she thought sadly, before she curled herself into bed and into a restless sleep. Requiem of a timeline. Thank you, Franny, Cornelius said, kissing his wife's cheek lovingly. She replied, the corners of her mouth twitching upward as she made one final brush through her hair. Placing the brush down, she looked at the reflection of her husband, who leaned behind her, arms wrapped around her waist, chin placed on her shoulder, glasses off, hair askew as usual. She lifted her hand, patting his cheek gently. How is she doing? With one more gentle squeeze, Cornelius took a step back, releasing his wife to allow her to turn around and face him properly. She's doing as well as to be expected in her situation. All we can do for her is help her keep moving forward. Franny smiled as she silenced her husband with a finger. Taking her hand into both of his, Cornelius kissed each finger gently. Thank you, Franny. Again, I know that ever since this whole business with the NSA started, I haven't been able to tell you much, and I haven't been at home much either, but Franny cut him off again, this time with a light kiss on his lips. Your heart is in the right place, Louis. It's always been. How can I not stand behind you? Shaking his head with a smile that was filled with so much love and adoration, Cornelius surprised her by sweeping his wife up into his arms. Franny let out a squeal, especially when Cornelius briefly lost his balance. The couple landed on the bed, both laughing, before they grew silent, soft smiles on their visages as they fell into a comfortable silence. Franny bit her lip nervously before saying, her voice small and hesitant, Do you think, she'll let me take her shopping? He brushed a loose strand of hair out of her face, avoiding what he knew he would find in her eyes. So, he kissed her forehead and said, Of course, dear, before turning off the lights. Chapter 10. Concealed Introductions. Part 1. As a super, Violet found herself in many situations that she wished she had avoided. Some she had foreseen the inevitable danger waiting before her, and somehow she had still blindly walked into. Like a fly to a light, she had simply been drawn to it, not knowing inevitably what she was heading towards. Standing in a makeshift inferno of a room, thick air dangerously pressing on her lungs, sweat rolling off her brow, and a force field threatening to collapse on itself. As piles and piles of heavy metal debris came crashing down, Violet wondered how she hadn't seen this coming. A little help. Here, she grunted, arms visibly shaking under the mental and physical strength her body was exerting, looking down at the masked young man, who was kneeling down next to an unconscious Cornelius Robinson. "Oh, shh," he said, holding his hands up to silence her. The girl's lips pursed tighter together. Whether out of concentration or frustration, the boy chose to ignore. "Give me a second. I'm thinking." His eyes quickly scanned the room. His mind rushed with several possible outcomes, each seeming worse and slightly more suicidal than the one before it. Searching, he found nothing before his brown eyes, before turning back to the struggling girl, holding up the shield around them. An idea hit him. He just hoped it would work. Getting up to his feet, he stood next to her. She glanced at him from the corner of her eyes, holding back the questions that were showing in her eyes, because she could obviously see the plan that was forming in his. "Do you trust me?" It caught her off guard. If the situation weren't currently so dire, Violet would have scoffed at his question with an added roll of her eyes. Reason would say no. She hardly knew this guy, dressed up like some modern Robin Hood with a mask. He had swept in, unannounced, causing much unnecessary confusion. However, as a super, there was a part of her, like a compass, that if she listened to it closely, she could hear the answer to his question. Instinct, maybe, though it felt stronger than that. Yes, he gave her a smile that was all too familiar, the name of his identity on the tip of her tongue, before he plunged a needle into her heart. Earlier that day, Violet was not necessarily what one would call a morning person. Sure, she was able to get up slightly easier than Dash, but she would never be considered a ray of sunshine in the morning. Her moody disposition was always present in the morning until she had fully awakened. This morning was no different, as light suddenly flooded into her room, the curtains being pushed to the side. Her mind still trying to catch up with her other senses, Violet didn't register the clicking nose of heeled shoes against tiled floors, or the light humming as anything other than her mother. Lena, somewhere in the back of her still groggy mind, she found it strange that her mother wasn't shaking her awake from the other side of the room. However, nothing seemed to register, as the girl buried herself deeper into her covers, incoherently begging for a few more minutes of sleep. "Now, dear, you can't waste away the day sleeping." Like having a bucket full of cold water splash on her, Violet quickly sat up, fighting back the dizziness of moving so quickly to look at her surroundings. Panic turned to solemn thoughts, as she remembered where she was and why. As if sensing her discomfort, a gentle hand patted Violet's reassuringly. Again the girl jumped, completely forgetting that she was not alone. "Oh my, jumpy aren't you?" The woman sitting on the edge of her bed chuckled. The woman was very pretty and nicely dressed, and from past experiences of looking at her reflection in the mirror in the morning, she could confidently say that the dead looked livelier than Violet did in the morning. Again, sensing Violet's quiet discomfort, the woman introduced herself with a comforting smile. "I'm Franny Robinson, Cornelius's wife." Violet vaguely remembered Mr. Robinson mentioning a wife. Nodding her head, Violet replied, "I'm Violet, Fowle." "No, it's Franny silenced her with a finger. "I know who you are, but to keep you safe while you're here, you'll be called Violet Vowell. You're a second cousin of Cornelius on his adoptive mother's, Lucille, side, who has come from North Montana to come and live with us, while the rest of your family are off traveling. Can you remember that?" "Yes." "Good. Franny clapped enthusiastically as she pulled the girl from bed with surprising strength. Now there's much to do today. She went over to what Violet assumed was a closet and pulled out a navy blue and white dress, a matching blue polka-dotted ribbon also in hand. Here, put this on. I hope it fits. We'll grab some toast and eggs from the kitchen, go downtown to find you some clothes that you'll like, and other odds and ends, like filling out your applications to begin school, grab lunch, and then sometime in the afternoon, Cornelius would like to see you at his company. Turning back from straightening various odds and ends in the room, she saw how the girl stood in the middle of the room, so unsure, overwhelmed, and lost in this new place. Motherly instincts took over, and Franny quickly went over to the girl, slowly embracing her, in case the girl didn't approve of her personal space being intruded upon. Franny's heart fluttered with maternal happiness when the wispy girl returned the hug, her frame shaking slightly. Pulling away from the girl slightly, Franny pushed stray strands of inky black hair from Violet's pale face, tucking them behind her ear. I can probably never imagine what you're going through, Violet, but I do hope you'll see us as family while you're here. Not as a replacement, though, she said, before Violet could even get the protest out, but as an extension, if that is all right. Violet bit her lip. It wouldn't do her to be rude to this woman, especially since she and her family had taken her in. So, she nodded, unprepared as Mrs. Robinson again smothered her in another hug. Pulling away one more time, Franny shooed her into the bathroom to get ready, quickly going through how to work some of the newer features in the room that Violet wasn't accustomed to yet. An hour later, Violet was ready. Perfect. Franny smiled approvingly before ushering her young charge out of the guest house and towards the main house. It was very large, several times larger than her family's house had been. Violet hoped that she wouldn't get lost inside it if she ever had to go inside alone. It's really big, Violet thought aloud to herself. Franny laughed, causing Violet to blush in embarrassment. I'm sure once you meet everyone in the family, you'll understand it when I say that it's probably not big enough. Entering the house, they came into the kitchen. Don't be startled by Lefty, was the only warning Violet received as a large purple octopus rounded the corner, carrying large stacks of plates on each tentacle. Instinctually, Violet tried to turn invisible only to swear colorfully when merely her pinky finger was unable to be seen. Glancing wearily back over at the octopus, Violet watched as it set down the stacks of dishes into what she assumed was the dishwasher, listening as Mrs. Robinson relayed a long list of jobs that needed to be done. The octopus nodded before turning one large yellow eye in Violet's direction before focusing back on Mrs. Robinson. Violet didn't know what was stranger, the fact that there was a giant purple octopus in front of her that was apparently the butler of the house, or the fact that she was starting to slowly understand the soft gurgling sound that said octopus was making a speech. Oh, and yes, can you please wake Wilbur up, Lefty? Franny finished off her list of tasks. I heard him sneaking back earlier this morning. He can't just sleep the whole day away or he'll be late for school. Lefty gave what was apparently a nod before leaving the room. Turning back to Violet, Franny took in the girl's still shaken state. Breathe, dear, she said, patting the girl's shoulder. One thing you need to know about this family is that we're definitely anything but normal. Managing a weak smile, Violet said, Sounds familiar. Requiem of a timeline. High school. To Wilbur it was something to fill his time, to keep some normalcy, or at least as much normalcy as he could as the son of Cornelius Robinson. As he walked through the automatic doors of the school's entrance, black leather jacket held tossed over his shoulder, 2 coffee patches applied to his toned arms, sunglasses hiding his blood-stained, tired eyes, and a deodorizing wad of gum being shoved discreetly into his mouth to hide the smell of the cigarette he had when Carl wasn't looking. Wilbur Robinson was viewed by some of his ogling peers as a god. To others, he was their future paycheck. Some a spoiled rich kid playing with daddy's money, and to many a source to be envied. They all stared behind 2 wide smiles, some turning into a flock of giggles and blushes when he entertained them with a wink as he passed them by. They would call out to him, greet him, some confident few giving him a high five as he passed them by. They all parted before him as he made his way down the hall. Even some teachers moved off to the side, giving him a wide breadth of space to pass through. He remembered when he was younger, and this would irk him to no end, that many of the kids in his class were either too afraid to approach him, or for the ones who did so in hopes to gain some sort of connection through the boy. Now, on the cusp of adulthood, Wilbur merely shrugged it off. It made things so much easier in the long run with his part-time job. Distances meant that his excuses and reasoning for turning down bucketful of holographic date invitations were more believable. No one had enough details about the workings of the young Robinson's life to know the truth from a lie, save for Adrian. And that's only because Adrian is... Wilbur shook his head, deciding that those thoughts were long in the past. Schooling his face into what everyone thought the son of the famous inventor Cornelius Robinson was supposed to look like. Carefree, approachable, and not knowing what pain and suffering felt like. Oh, how they knew nothing about the real Wilbur Robinson. Requiem of a timeline. Mrs. Robinson clapped her hands appreciatively as she looked Violet over. Yes, that will do just fine. We'll take all of them, please. The blonde that was in the large changing room nodded before disappearing with a slight flash. Still not used to the idea of such realistic holograms, Violet jumped slightly, only managing to not turn herself invisible, though she was still unable to get anything more than one body part invisible at a time currently. "You're doing wonderful, dear," Franny reassured the girl. It was obvious that the girl still felt totally out of her element. Growing up around the same time of The Incredibles, Franny knew that if they had lived in one of the lower-level cities, then Violet wouldn't find that many differences comparing things then to now. However, Todayland was a feat in itself, thanks to her husband, and had things that some couldn't even imagine a decade ago. Sanot. Taking a deep breath, Violet stood straighter, this time barely flinching when the holographic saleswoman reappeared, a hand extending out from the wall, holding the neatly wrapped clothes they had purchased. "Would you like to take the bags with you, or for us to deliver them to your residence?" the saleswoman asked. Violet cut Franny off before she could answer. "The Robinson residence, please," the young super said, remembering what she had seen Franny do in several stores before, holding out her hand as a small podium rose from the ground, with a handprint scanner on it. The device beeped positively, confirming that she was indeed a resident at the Robinson home before retracting. "Very well, Miss Vowell. Your purchases should be there when you return." The holographic nodded. "Thank you for shopping with us. Please come again and have a wonderful day." And then she was gone. Turning sheepishly to Mrs. Robinson, Violet looked for a nod of approval that she hadn't overstepped her boundaries. She was relieved to see that the woman, if anything, looked reassured at the girl's ability to adapt. It was something that Violet found herself doing a lot as a super. You always had to adapt to the situation, or the world would adapt to you being dead. Going outside, the two walked towards the family hover car, though, in essence, the transportation bubbles were as big as any force field Violet and her brother used to roll around in, and much faster than a hover car. It still terrified the girl that this strange form of transportation was nothing more than fortified blowing bubbles. Dash would have loved the experience of floating in a giant bubble and then riding down the many tubes that connected the bubble system to different locations. Biting her lip to make the pain she was feeling in her heart physical, Violet was relieved when Franny started a conversation up. The woman was very intuitive, much like her mother, and didn't treat Violet as if she were some clueless child because of her situation. The woman was beautiful, and the more she talked to her, the more Violet understood how Mr. Robinson fell for this woman. Mrs. Robinson was loving, sincere, honest, and gentle, but she also knew that the woman had a fierce side, if what she heard as the woman had went upstairs herself earlier that morning to wake up her son for school, whom Violet had still yet to meet, was any indication. Pushing some hair that had gotten free from her hairband out from her face, Violet realized that she was becoming comfortable around this woman. But not too comfortable, she thought. Once her family was fully back to health, she would undoubtedly have to leave the Robinsons and their generous hospitality. Let Violet! Snapping her head to the source calling her name, Violet realized she had been daydreaming. Sorry? What did you just say, Mrs. Robinson? I said we're heading now towards the school you'll be attending to complete some paperwork. It's the same high school that Wilbur, my son, goes to. Franny furrowed her brow slightly. You still haven't met him, have you? Violet shook her head. Well, maybe we'll run into him on the way to the office. Violet nodded before asking without thinking, What's Wilbur like? Franny laughed as she kept her eyes on traffic, causing the younger female's cheeks to redden slightly. Many people think he takes after me. Impulsive, loud, energetic. He has my family's signature hair trait, she said, pointing to the curl of hair that insisted to defy gravity. Violet had merely thought it was a fashion statement. However, people who think that are obviously not close to the family, since Wilbur takes more after Cornelius than me. Violet twirled a lock of her hair around her finger, imagining a geeky-looking but adorable blonde with a defiant cowlick and possibly taped-up glasses. The idea made Violet giggle softly. So he's a genius like Mr. Robinson? Franny took a few minutes to respond before finally saying, In his own way. The discussion ended there. For some unknown reason, the light and comforting atmosphere of before was gone. Violet couldn't quite place why. Before she could think further on it, Mrs. Robinson was pulling into a parking spot. Here we are, she declared, getting out from the car. Violet looked at the pristine structure that was made out of glass and other futuristic architecture and gulped. She should have been used to new schools and being the new kid. Before her family came out as the Incredibles, there was a brief period of time where she had gone to 8 different schools because her father couldn't control his need to do good. Looking up at the educational institution, she felt a tight gripping of her gut. She had a feeling that no matter what time period it was school, and a high school now would be the same as high school then. A living hell. China. Requiem of a timeline. This was such a living hell. He pressed his forehead further on the cool surface of his desk. It did nothing to alleviate his headache. His head was spinning. Thoughts were racing through his mind faster than he was able to comprehend where the thought originated and where it ended. Nutst. It was a side effect that happened at some point after each injection, though knowing the pain was coming didn't help make it any better. It affected him differently each time it occurred. Oh, he needed aspirin. He needed this class to end. He needed a smoke. Mr. Robinson, am I boring you? He held back a groan, wanting to reply back that yes, his science teacher's lecture was boring to the point of mental implosion. He held back his retort. He was the son of Cornelius Robinson. Image control. He reminded himself through the chaotic racing of his mind. Mute, lifting his head, he met the irritated glare of Mr. Johnson. The man was in much need of a retirement, but the school held on to him because he had won some award in rocket science years ago. Of course, the man was slightly bitter towards Cornelius Robinson, who had taken away most of the attention from him a week later, when Cornelius invented a device that helped people remember forgotten memories. Johnson never really entirely got over his glory being taken, and thus held some petty resentment for the inventor that he loved to project on Wilbur. However, Wilbur wasn't new to man's attempted plans at trying to embarrass him. Sitting up straight and hoping he could keep the irritation from his voice, whether because of his headache or his teacher, Wilbur gave an easy grin. No, sir, of course not. Then I suppose you can answer this question about the history of the drug Potentia. I mean, your father did have a lecture about it a few years ago. I'm sure you heard it plenty of times. Johnson stated, crossing, his arms waiting. Of all the drugs, Wilbur thought, never letting his grin falter despite that his hands clutches at the edge of his desk tighter. Sure, no problem, Mr. Johnson. Stepping away from his lecture podium, the educator gave his student a gesture to take the stand. Getting up with almost effortless calm, no one was aware of his racing heartbeat. Finally turning to stand before the class of his peers, and one bitter old teacher, Wilbur's eyes scanned the room quickly, not catching Adrian's careful gaze, but noticing as his friend pulled a long sleeve further down an arm that was sure to have small but visible injection needle sites. He thought of another arm, not his and not Adrian's, that looked similar, marked with many small injection sites. More than what was safe. Potentia, he began, is a chemically modified version of an unknown organic substance. The organic substance is believed to be from some sort of animal, though, causing many animal rights activists to protest for it to be banned sometime in 2021. Diwa, was it banned? Johnson questioned, hoping the answer would trip his student up. He thought of sirens. He couldn't remember if they had been police or ambulances. Yes, but not for those reasons, Wilbur answered without hesitation. By the time the activist could even think about working out the plans for a protest, the government had already beat them to it. Never before had there been a collective vote in Senate history where all members unanimously voted for illegalization of the drug. Name the effects. Adrian still looked bored, but the pencil that twirled around nimble fingers seemed to speed up anxiously, betraying the calm mask. Tangled matted raven hair, framing pale skin and lips tinged blue. Wilbur shook his head, clearing his racing thoughts before giving his teacher a charming smile that made some of the girls in his class audibly sigh. I was just getting to that. Turning back to the class, he cleared his throat. Now, there are many reasons why potentia was and still is being taken. One use of potentia is for the high effect, said to be better than marijuana. However, some people believe in its liquid form that it increases natural abilities. No definite reason is known since when the drug had been first reported to the authorities. It was in small, almost untestable portions that couldn't be reproduced. However, the people who had taken it had extreme side effects including paranoia, delusions, cardio arrest, and suicidal thoughts leading to death. Adrian's pencil snapped, just as the bell signaling the end of class rang. Wilbur raced back to his seat to grab his things, grabbing Adrian's arm on his way out, and giving a fuming Mr. Johnson a mock salute. "You okay?" he asked his friend once they were finally out of earshot. Adrian chuckled humorlessly, leaning slightly on Wilbur. "I was about to ask you that. You're looking pale." "Very pale." He held her hand very close to his face, hoping, praying that his warmth could be felt and that her cold skin would warm. It didn't. Wilbur shook his head, clearing it from distracting thoughts. "I'm fine, but I'll probably have Carl call me home sick." Adrian nodded. "I'll probably wind up ditching, too. You don't even have to be here anymore. You could have graduated last year." "I know." Adrian sighed before giving a small, comforting smile. "But then who would keep you out of trouble?" Chuckling, Wilbur shrugged. "That is an excellent question. Don't think I would want to find out." Adrian replied with a knowing smirk before beginning to walk off. "Get some rest, love, and I mean it. Your father didn't build Todayland in a day." Wilbur sighed, leaning against the cool surface of a locker and letting out a tired sigh as dizziness seemed to take over him. If only it were that simple. He muttered, "Requiem of a timeline. Kay? He doesn't quite remember his bed being this hard. He doesn't remember the pain cutting through his head quite this intense. Hey, did you hear me? Are you okay?" He doesn't remember his voice being quite that high or frantic. Frantic was bad. People could slip under the mask at any sign of uncertainty. "I'm fine." Wait, that was his voice. Strained, dry, parched, but his. Then to whom did the other voice belong? Finally, the rest of his senses decided to catch up with his mind, his eyes finally taking in what was around him. He was on the floor. That explained why his bed felt hard. His hand lifted to his head, where he felt a knot beginning to form. He vaguely remembered bumping into something. Was it a door? A locker door, perhaps? Yes, that seemed right. Many of the electronic lockers at the school were in need of replacing, particularly because of their habit of opening at any slight disturbance. Now, who was talking to him? A girl? A brunette? No, her hair was more inky black with a soft sheen that almost seemed blue. Blue eyes? No. Wrong again. They were indigo. Must be contacts, he thought. She was pretty, but he had met a lot of pretty girls before. He wouldn't be surprised if he had met her before, or if they shared a class. All the girls at this school had started to blend together. He wasn't being vain or snobby. He just wasn't interested. He hadn't been ever since. He shook his head, pulling himself to his feet, causing the girl to let out a small squeak of surprise as she scrambled to step back, giving him room to stand. "Oh, are you okay?" she asked again. "I mean, you hit that, locker door pretty hard," she explained. So it was the damn locker, he thought, before mustering up as much strength as possible to turn on his public Wilbur Robinson face, giving her a smile that had over time earned him a small fan club. "I'm fine," Wilbur said, giving her a small bow. "Thanks to you, miss." He watched as she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear nervously. "They always get shy when they talk to me," Wilbur thought, slightly annoyed. Too many girls had put on the shy act in a desperate attempt to be cute and gain his attention and also his checkbook, while the stuttering and embarrassed blushes had begun to take a toll on the young Robinson's patience when the girl said two things that he surprisingly would never forget after she took a deep breath that not only seemed to calm her, but also exude a sense of confidence that she didn't appear to have before. The first, her name, Vowel, Violet Vowel, and the second, something that made Wilbur's mouth open and close like a fish at how obviously serious, honest, and unaware of who he was when she asked, "Who are you?" Chapter 11, Concealed Introductions, Part 2. Earlier, it was somewhere between the water fountain and the holographic announcement board that she gave in, and admitted to herself that she was lost on her way back from the bathroom. A plump woman who had introduced herself as Mrs. Green had met Violet and Mrs. Robinson at the doors of Todayland High School. Violet had barely taken a step into the school when her stomach twisted dangerously with nervousness, and she had quickly asked to be directed to the nearest bathroom. Deciding to go on ahead to her office, Mrs. Green had given her what seemed at the time to be simple directions to her office before she and Mrs. Robinson had departed. It wasn't until her stomach had finally quieted a few minutes later that Violet realized that the educational institution she had found herself in seemed built like a maze. Not wanting to interrupt a class full of students she would surely have time to embarrass herself in front of later, Violet quietly traversed the halls, hoping to either find Mrs. Green's office or someone who could point her, or better yet, show her the right direction. Dash had always been better with directions. Violet always assumed that it was because of some sort of heightened ability he possessed. It sometimes amazed her that he was able to move from place to place at light speed without running into a wall, when he needed to turn their giant speeding bubble at high speeds. Her father had always said that a great ability for a super to have was the intrinsic sense of direction, something Violet had never acquired. It had always been fine, though. As a team, the Incredibles had always managed to pick up and defend each other's weaknesses. However, now, who was to watch her back? The sound of something hard smacking into something equally as hard jarred the young super out of her thoughts, bringing startled indigo eyes to land just in time on the collapsing figure ahead of her. Her super instincts once again taking over, Violet found herself instantly kneeling down next to the person, a boy who had seemingly walked right into the door of a metal opening that had already closed on its own. And he was unconscious. That much was blatantly obvious to Violet. The real question was what to do. She didn't have a cell phone, wasn't even sure if cell phones even existed anymore in this time, and they seemed to be located in an area that was strictly composed of lockers. She couldn't even remember what direction the last classroom she had passed was. Knowing there was no time to just sit there and be useless, her NSA training took over. She leaned over the boy, ear hovering over his mouth, hearing and feeling soft but steady breaths of air, and seeing that none of his airways were blocked. She checked his pulse. Violet was about to turn him onto his side when he started to move. She moved back a little from hovering over him, watching with relief as he regained consciousness. "Are you okay?" she found herself asking. He didn't answer. Instead, dark, unfocused brown eyes opened, staring at the ceiling. She bit her lip as he just lay there, not making any further movement. Worried that he had a concussion, she tried again. "Hey!" she called out, trying to push the panic from her voice. "Did you hear me? Are you okay?" He blinked and then blinked again before slowly, but finally answering with a hoarse, "I'm fine," before Violet could get another word out. He was sitting up before getting to his feet, causing Violet to also get up as well, in order not to bump into him. She watched, self-conscious as his dazed gaze began to focus on her. Are you okay? I mean, you hit that, it was a locker, right?" she wondered. "Locker door pretty hard." He stared blankly at her, a cold, emotionless expression that unnerved her, before his face suddenly broke out into a friendly smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm fine," he said again, giving her a small bow that would sweep any other girl off her feet. For Violet, however, it made her slightly uneasy. "Thanks to you, miss." She supposed there was reason as to why Mrs. Robinson had drilled her constantly throughout their shopping trip on giving and answering to her new name. Thinking of the strong, beautiful, older female, Violet regained a speck of the confidence that she had once had and worked so hard to gain. "Vowel, Violet Vowel, who are you?" To say he looked flabbergasted would have been an understatement. Jaw dropped, trying to grasp for something to say. Violet found him looking very much like a fish. Before she could even think about stuttering out an apology for whatever she had mistakenly said to offend the boy, he began laughing hysterically. You honestly don't know?" he asked, laughing harder when a bright blush ran across her cheeks. Crossing her arms angrily, Violet tapped her foot, waiting for the boy to calm down. I'm sorry. The boy apologized sincerely, causing Violet to lose some of her fire. "You must really not be from around here." She cleared her throat, mentally running through her new personal history. "I'm from North Montana," Violet explained. "My family is constantly moving, and I got tired of it, so my parents agreed to let me stay with my second cousin's family here. I'm supposed to be registering for classes here with my cousin's wife, but I got lost on the way from the bathroom." She finished softly, looking down at her shoes with embarrassment. The boy sighed, and when she looked back up, he gave her a graceful bow. "Well, milady, if it is aid you need, then you have found it in the dashing knight, Sir Will." She couldn't help herself. She let out a soft laugh. "Ah, milady smiles," the boy Will said while placing a hand over his heart. "My heart goes a-flutter as your beauty bewitches me." Violet's smile widened as she rolled her eyes before placing the back of her hand against her forehead with a fake swoon. "Oh, Sir Will, you must say that to all of the fair ladies of Todayland." Will chuckled before suddenly leaning closer to her, making her aware that she was almost trapped between the lockers and this strange boy. "Only the beautiful ones," he winked, voice husky. Several things happened too quickly for Violet to process. One was how the still receding blush on her cheeks came back with a vengeance. Second was the hot fury when Will pushed himself away laughing, humorlessly, coldly gasping between chuckles something that sounded distinctly like, "just like the others," as he leaned against a locker next to her. She was furious, about to yell something, anything at this cocky boy, when finally it happened. It was habit that forced her hands up, when one of the mechanical lockers short-circuited, door flying straight at Violet's face at nose-breaking speeds. And it was habit, instinct, and a voice that sounded very much like her parents, that told her to run as the boy before her stared wide-eyed at not the instantly dented metal door, but at the shimmering force field that had appeared before her hands. Nas, Requiem of a timeline. "Mr. Robinson, your 2 o'clock appointment is here." Sighing, a certain inventor lifted his head from the specs for a new device he was creating. Putting his pencil down and pushing off from his desk with his foot, he allowed his rolling chair to glide past mountains of odds and ends and crumbled blueprints to press the button on the intercom hidden between stacks of books. "Thank you, Samantha. Direct them to the conference room, please, and tell them I'll be right up," Cornelius said. "Yes, Mr. Robinson." The intercom buzzed once before the room was once again silent. Sighing, Cornelius got to his feet. Bags were beginning to form under his eyes due to countless sleepless nights. His return from the NSA had been greeted with stacks of reports and documents that needed his approval, along with a frazzled secretary staff that had been bombarded with legal filings. Using his chair as support, he stiffly got up, feeling the dregs of time and age finally catching up with him. So, legal filings, a term his lawyers used whenever the inventor stirred up any sort of negative response with some sort of advocacy rights group. It was a term they used to make minuscule the situation, to make Cornelius shrug it off and return to what he did best, inventing, while they did what they did best. Pay the protesters a generous offer, tied neatly with financial and legal threats, to make them settle down. Cornelius didn't like this process, but neither did he like radical groups threatening his family and employees. He never met these protesters, per his lawyer's orders. They were small fries. The fact that his legal advisors had strongly urged him to attend today's meeting did not bode well with Cornelius. Stripping off his grease-stained lab coat, he shrugged stiffly into a slightly wrinkled suit jacket, straightening his tie as he was swept away in one of the many interconnecting travel tubes that shot him into the lobby right outside of the designated meeting room. Running his hand through his continuously disheveled hair, he took a deep breath before taking a step inside. He was a little surprised when he found the room empty, his lawyers nowhere in sight. Save for a lone figure that sat at the seat at the head of the table, Cornelius's seat. "Ah, Mr. Robinson, I have been waiting for you. Have a seat." Requiem of a timeline. "Well, that wasn't that bad after all, now was it?" Mrs. Green chuckled, opening the door to her office to allow Mrs. Robinson and Violet out. "Hopefully you won't get lost next time you return for classes, dear," she directed towards the strangely quiet girl. Violet nodded, mind miles away though. As they walked back to the school's entrance, Franny frowned, noticing Violet's tense shoulders, constantly shifting eyes, and jumpy reactions to the slightest of noises in the empty halls. "Is everything all right, Violet?" Startled, Violet nearly tripped over her own 2 feet at the question. Regaining her balance, she stuttered out an "I'm fine," before her nervous habit of tucking her loose hair back appeared. The frown on Franny's face deepened, but she knew from experience that whatever was causing the girl to act strangely, it would eventually be revealed. "We're stopping by Cornelius's office quickly before going home," Franny informed as they reached the hover car. "Perhaps you'll see my son there once he's done with school. He sometimes does odd jobs there whenever he's needed for some spare cash." Preoccupied, Violet gave a very slow nod, teeth still whirring at her bottom lip, as the hover car rose and took off into the air, unaware of the brown eyes watching her. Requiem of a timeline. For what felt like maybe the 100th time, Violet let out a loud sigh, gaining the irritated attention of Mr. Robinson's youngest secretary. The young super shifted in her seat at the woman's irate glare, wondering what had gotten the woman so tightly wound. In retrospect, Violet thought, a lot of the workers seemed on edge earlier, as Mrs. Robinson had led her to where her husband's office was located. The sleek clock on the wall across from her ticked away, accompanied by the almost silent typing of the secretary. "Samantha," her desk plate read, doing nothing to ease the apprehension and anxiousness Violet felt, even before Mrs. Robinson had left to go talk to her husband alone. Closing her eyes, Violet took what she hoped was a silent deep breath, so as to not to disturb the secretary anymore. She was in deep trouble. That much was obvious, as she thought about her run-in with Will earlier today. Maybe he didn't see anything, she thought, before she mentally slapped herself. Or maybe not mentally. Judging by the startled look Samantha was giving her, along with the subsiding stinging she felt on her cheek, looking down at her hands, she tried to mentally call forth an invisible sphere within them. She gave up when nothing happened, feeling a disconnect from her powers as she fell deeper into her thoughts. Preoccupied with these thoughts, Violet didn't notice a familiar figure giving Samantha a heart-throbbing smile and wink, along with a few bills. Cocking his head in the direction of the employee lounge, Violet was totally unaware of what was happening around her until she felt something pressed against the back of her head. Her whole body went tense, until years of training brought to mind that what she was feeling were 2 fingers against her head attempting to mimic a gun. In a better mood, she would have laughed herself silly at this situation. "Don't scream," the voice behind her whispered in her ear. "Now get up." Refraining from rolling her eyes, Violet played along, her heart pounding wildly despite the fact that she knew she was in no immediate danger. Her mother's words of never assuming played in the back of her ignored. A hand, not the one with fingers pointing towards her head, grabbed her arm. She tensed at the rough, bruising hold, but as quickly as it had come, it lessened. Guided through a long corridor and down several flights of stairs that she was surprised even existed in such a futuristic building. She was about to ask if they were at wherever he was taking her, when a door slid open and she was pushed inside. She felt a slight prick in her arm before the pressure that she had forgotten was placed against her head disappeared. Before she could even turn around, the person behind her ran over to a table, unscrewing a vial of blood, her blood from a needle, and putting it in a machine. Already having a clue as to who her captor was, after hearing his poorly disguised voice, Violet decided to ignore him, and her still rapidly beating heart to look around the room they were in. It was a somewhat small room, the many machines and test tubes in it making the room seem even smaller than it actually was. A whiteboard with equations and symbols that were unknown to Violet was pushed over against a wall, while machine parts lay pushed against a corner. Looking up, a robotic arm, wires exposed, hung unnervingly above her like a claw waiting to snatch her up. That was surprising. Violet's head whipped back to the person now standing in front of her, who, in retrospect, had too many physical similarities to Mrs. Robinson that she was surprised she hadn't noticed who she had been talking to what felt like years ago in the empty halls of Todayland High School. Wilbur Robinson. He shrugged, a small smirk playing on his face, though. "Ah, so you have heard of me. Took you long enough. You know, I actually thought that little trick you did in the school was machine-based." He took his time to grabbing a flashlight and crossing the borders of her personal space to flash it in her eyes. "You know, some sort of device that used magnetic particles to repel. Doesn't seem like you're wearing contacts. Recessive trait?" He barely flinched when she smacked the flashlight out of her face, instead his smirk growing into a boyish grin. "But it wasn't, was it? It wasn't machined-based?" he asked eagerly. Violet took a step back, which Wilbur matched with a step forward. Heart beating rapidly once again, Violet struggled to remain calm. Look," she said, taking another step back, looking back quickly to judge the distance between her and the door. "I don't know what you're talking about or what you saw, but you're wrong about me. You're a horrible liar." Anger flared up within the young woman. "So that gives you the right to take me hostage?" Taking a step forward, she didn't hesitate to surprise the boy by poking him hard in the chest. "Who do you think you are?" A smirk that was easily as infuriating as it was cocky appeared on Wilbur's face before he lunged at her. Instincts took over. Wilbur found himself lying on his stomach, arm twisted behind his back. His smirk turned into a grin. "That is an excellent question." The air escaped from Violet's lungs as she found herself on her back. Wilbur hovering over her with a grin, before getting to his feet, hand extended out to her. "Look, Violet, if that is your name." "It is." Ignoring his hand, Violet got up to her feet on her own. "See, this is good. We're being honest with each other. Not bad, eh?" Wilbur chuckled as he turned back to his desk, where the machine housing the sample of Violet's blood sat. "So, are you going to tell me who and what you are, or am I just going to have to find out for myself?" he asked. Violet scoffed, strangely finding herself much more relaxed in this situation than she should be. Is that a threat? A shock that went throughout all of the building, and blaring red emergency lights and sirens answered her. Chapter 12. Concealed Introductions. Part 3. He remembered it was perhaps around his father's 5th or 6th assassination attempt, a year or so after his adventure with his father's younger self, that he met them. The inventor's lawyers thought it would be best to have a press conference where the inventor would acknowledge and respond to some of the company's recent controversy. Of course, Cornelius Robinson's usual slacks, tie, and a lab coat weren't going to cut it. Sinat, enter Edna Mode. Watching from his window, Wilbur had been amused seeing the pint-sized woman appraise the Robinson family's lawn. She had inspected each shrub and bush with a critical eye, before her old but still sharp eyes landed on their prime target, Mr. Robinson. While Cornelius found himself being interrogated thoroughly, more than he ever thought necessary for a simple change in wardrobe, Wilbur found his eyes drawn to a small thin wisp of a figure following behind Edna, an amused smile hidden behind slender fingers, as she watched the pint-sized woman stun the fully grown figure of Mr. Robinson into compliance. It was just as Wilbur was contemplating whether or not the risk of trying out a prank on the two visitors would be worth the punishment, his mother would think up for him, that a pair of hazel eyes looked up, locking with his. And it was at that moment that Wilbur Robinson found himself hopelessly in love with a hazel-eyed wisp of a girl, Requiem of a timeline. Somehow she found herself following him, pushing against the crowd of workers that were heading in the opposite direction to the emergency exits. "Something is wrong?" Wilbur shouted over the blaring emergency sirens. This building was designed so that things like lab-caused fires are put out immediately, and the best of the best security in the world has been installed. Not even the end of the world should be able to bring this place down. Violet shook her head, trying to shake out the ringing the alarms were causing in her ears, as she deftly weaved through the crowd, following the boy. She honestly didn't know why she was following him. Hadn't he basically threatened her a few minutes before? Shouldn't she be looking for either Mr. or Mrs. Robinson and get away from their lunatic son? And yet, her lithe body danced through the crowds, continuing to follow him. "Where are we going?" He didn't respond immediately. Violet was about to repeat her question when he suddenly grabbed her hand, before quickly pushing her through an open door. She crashed into the opposite wall, some items on the shelves above her falling haphazardly from their places onto the ground. Violet ducked, covering her head until things ceased their falling before looking up, an angry comment dying on her tongue, as she noticed that she was in what looked like a supply closet. Alone. There's an emergency hatch in there. Use it before this whole place comes crashing down." She heard Wilbur shout from the other side of the door, voice rising above all the noise of the outside chaos. And then, just like that, she heard his footsteps fade quickly away. "Wilbur," Violet said, pressing against the locked door, as if that would direct her as to where the boy went, before anger filled her again, and she pounded angrily against the door. "Wilbur, Requiem of a timeline." As a shiver ran through him, he wondered if that was a sign that he'll pay for locking Violet in a supply closet. He chuckled, shaking his head as he whipped around a corner. "Oh well," he murmured somewhat lightheartedly. With the flash of an alarm light, his soft countenance turned hard. His mind was buzzing with memorized blueprints of the building's layout, scenarios, and lists. Pushing against his beehive-like mind, he focused on the list of things he needed to do. Get rid of the girl. Check. He pressed a button on his watch, his clothes sucking into the compartment like something through a black hole. The security cameras that were still working had their feeds flicker before going out completely. His black t-shirt and jeans were replaced by a dark blue bodysuit. Locate parents, check. He stopped in front of the stairs that led up to Cornelius Robinson's office. Be the hero. He flipped up the hood of his suit, while simultaneously placing on a plain black mask. Check. Requiem of a timeline. It happened so fast. She had waited in her husband's office until he had returned back from his meeting. The sight that met Franny Robinson was one that the public and much of their family never saw, but one that Franny herself was very much privy to. He looked tired, and the boyish features that always gave him a youthful look were hard and worn. He didn't look like Cornelius Robinson, father of the future. The lost look in his eyes reminded Franny very much of Lewis Robinson, the young orphan boy not sure where his life was going. His blue eyes met her brown ones. Nothing was said as he embraced her, his body shaking though tears never came. "They're going to put me under arrest," he sighed. "What?" Franny pulled away from him, hoping that this was some horrible joke. "House arrest," Cornelius clarified. "Violet's parents," he said, stressing the word, not wanting to mention the NSA directly, "were able to pull some strings for me and get my sentence down to house arrest." Franny shook her head, still not believing this. "But for what?" Cornelius ran his hand through his graying hair, plopping into a nearby seat, arm covering his eyes. It was at moments like these where Franny was reminded how much Wilbur was similar to his father. A whole slew of things. See, Cornelius, what is going to happen to the company? He put his arm down, though he was still staring at the ceiling. I don't know. The alarms went off. Both Franny and Cornelius jumped at the sudden noise. Pressing a button on his desk, a screen popped up in front of Cornelius. Weary eyes scanned over security alerts, widening with each second. What's wrong? Cornelius looked at her before grabbing her arm and pulling her towards the emergency evacuation chute. Cornelius! He grabbed her by the shoulders, staring intently at her. There are bombs, he whispered, before pushing her into the chute, watching her zip off forcibly. She didn't see as a chunk of ceiling landed on her husband, rendering him unconscious. Fusdingni, Requiem of a timeline. The bombs went off like clockwork. As each vibration went through her, she knew she was losing time. She glanced at the emergency tube. It would be so easy to just get in it and be safe, to not put her new regained life in danger. It would be so easy. But unfortunately, easy wasn't in the vocabulary of a super. Come on, Vi, she muttered to herself, her mind already trying to figure a way out. She glared at the black band around her finger, the power inhibitor she was forced to wear. Her powers currently weren't reliable. If the results of 10 minutes of concentration with nothing but a small dull purple spark meant anything, that was fine, though. A super's greatest tool, even greater than their powers, is their mind. A whisper of a memory of her mother reminded her. As she critically eyed the door, she noticed the hinges of the door. For the hinges of a door in one of the most advanced building in the city, if not the world, the hinges were surprisingly very rusty. Looking for just the right thing, Violet let out a cry of triumph when her eyes landed on a heavy enough-looking metal canister. She grabbed it, arms shaking at the sudden heavy weight, raising it above her head before slamming it down on the worn door hinges. She slammed the canister down several times before all the hinges broke. Putting the canister down, she backed up slightly in the already small enclosed space, centering herself before putting all her strength into a well-aimed kick. The door had barely landed on the ground before she was already out running. The halls, once packed with people, were now empty. Flashes of the emergency lights washing the halls in an eerie red color. She didn't know what she could even do without her powers, besides a few hand-to-hand combat moves her father had taught her. But that thought barely registered for her as she continued to run, the familiar feel of adrenaline pumping through her veins. She had to make sure Mr. and Mrs. Robinson had made it out safe. Wilbur as well, she thought, as a side note rolling her eyes. The young super barely knew the boy, and he had already usurped Dash from his position as the most annoying person she knew. Violet's thoughts lingered on her brother, her family, before she forced the waves of self-pity and loathing that she had still yet to sort through to the back of her mind. Emotions were needed as a super, but getting too caught up in them could be fatal. A clear mind was key. Her senses were on high alert. Violet eyes narrowed as the smell of smoke not only got stronger, but also made the air around her thick. The realization that none of the fire sprinklers had seemed to have gone off had just barely made it to her consciousness when she noticed something attached to the wall only just a few feet away. "Oh no," she whispered, as a small red light began to blink rapidly, and the numbers neared the end of the countdown of the bomb. As it ticked down to 0, the young super's last thought was that she never got the chance to punch that Wilbur kid. Requiem of a timeline. Helen had taken her out for a girls-only patrol once. Even though the older super, once known as Elastigirl, now Mrs. Incredible, was her mother, even Violet would admit secretly, and only to herself, though that her mother was probably one of her biggest models of a strong, mentally and physically female super. Just a little after Violet had turned 16, her parents, and sometimes even Frozone, took her out on duo missions. Nothing too intense like what happened with Syndrome, but still more than petty robberies. Violet always looked forward to these missions, her stomach flipping with excitement and nervousness. No one ever said it directly, but it was an unspoken acknowledgement that she was being prepared to go solo. It was such an exhilarating and humbling thought, and completely terrifying. Looking down at the streets of Metroville, from the roof of one of the tallest buildings in Metroville, the sun having set a few hours ago, Violet felt herself becoming restless with the lack of activity tonight. Sam, relax, Vi, her mother chuckled, sensing the girl's restless energy. If there's no crimes happening tonight, then that means we've been doing our job well. Sighing, the young woman turned her gaze, hidden behind her mask, to her mother. Mom, what if I can't protect a city by myself? She voiced her fears that she had been withholding for months. Now, there had been a part of her that feared if she did voice it to her parents, they would see it as evidence that she shouldn't go solo at all. However, her mother's reassuring smile instantly put her to ease, as elastic arms gently crossed the distance between the two, pulling the young super towards her elder in a comforting hug. Vi, her mother sighed, stroking her head. Going solo doesn't mean that you're alone. Yeah, there's more responsibility, and the risks are higher, but it's not a permanent thing, sweetie. It's a transition phase, she said, hugging her daughter tighter. Don't get me wrong, though. I am a firm proponent that all women, super or not, should be able to know how to handle things themselves so that they're not always dependent on a man. But honey, she said, stepping back slightly to take her daughter's face in her hands, going solo doesn't mean you don't rely on others. It's a transition until you find your partner. A sidekick? Violet questioned. Images of a younger syndrome following her father around in his glory days entered her mind. Helen chuckled. Not exactly, sweetheart, but it's a possibility, I suppose. You know, before I was even interested romantically in your father, we were partners. Of sorts. I would have never mentioned it then. Too deep in my girl power phase, and your dad was a bit of a sexist jerk, but I knew I could rely on him and Frozone as well to have my back in a tight situation, and they always came, whether I wanted them to or not. Helen chuckled again, Violet watching her mother's eyes cloud over as she thought of a fond memory. Looking back at Violet, Helen stroked her cheek gently, in a way that only a mother could achieve, easing away any residual uncertainties. You still have a while, though. It takes time to find people you can put your complete trust in, and vice versa. It's a special thing, whether it ends romantically or not. But when you do, neither death or time can really break that bond. Don't try to grow up too soon, though. Mrs. Incredible sighed, pulling Violet once again into another hug, this time for her benefit instead of her daughter's. Let your old mom have your back for just a little bit longer. All right? Smiling into her mother's neck, breathing in the smell of comfort and safety that always seemed to cling to her mother, Violet nodded. Okay. Requiem of a timeline. Don't worry, I got you. Violet opened her eyes, her head throbbing. The world around her, another supply closet, spun in nauseating turns. She really hoped she hadn't gotten herself drunk again. She thought, closing her eyes again. It was when she felt something drip down the side of her head that her eyes shot open, touching the area. Her hand pulled away to reveal blood. Her blood. Nasty cut. The deep voice from before, that she just now noticed, grunted. Before she could get a good look at him in her somewhat still dazed state, the male kneeled down in front of her, head bent, obscuring her vision of his face with his hood. However, she was able to catch sight of the familiar-looking black mask that was placed firmly on his face. For some reason, that seemed to ease any feeling of indignation she might have had as he ripped the hem of her dress into a long strip that he used to wrap around the cut on her head. That'll have to do. Come on. Time to go. Do you think you can stand? She nodded. Her mind was screaming at her, telling her to be wary of this masked man, whether he helped her or not. She knew nothing about him, and things were no longer as simple as they were before she had been put to sleep. However, for some reason, Violet ignored what her rational thoughts were telling her. In a time where being a super was truly a criminal offense, more so than it ever was before her family became the Incredibles, here was this person, donning a mask that spoke just as loudly of what he was, just as the black band around her finger did of her. She wasn't alone anymore. He looked at her. The barely visible part of his face, the part covered by his mask, shifted under the shadow of his hood. She flushed when she realized her must have been saying something to her. What? She began. I'm sorry, We need to get out of here, but the building is collapsing around us. Can you create a shield? Well, She began before pausing, her mind finally winning over as fight or flight finally took over. How had he known? Who are you? She demanded, hoping her voice had more conviction than what she actually heard. The building shook again, and instead of answering her question, he bent down and picked something off the ground, slinging it over his shoulder. A body. He paused, looking at Violet before he slowly straightened up, looking as non-threatening as possible. It's Mr. Robinson, he clarified, voice tight. I found him. The ceiling fell on him. Still alive, though. Violet gasped, taking a step forward in the already small-spaced room. We need to get him to help, she said, examining the unconscious man before turning towards her new hooded companion. Nodding, the man turned towards the door. Stay close to me. That bomb that got you was the last one that exploded in a while, but there could still be more. Just stay close to me, he said, already turning to open the door when he felt a hand on his arm. Why should I trust you? He didn't look back at her as he opened the door. Do you really have a choice? As soon as the door was open, smoke filled the room, her eyes watering and coughs restricting her breathing. A gloved hand wrapped around her arm, tugging her past the fire and smoke that seemed to engulf the hallway and other parts of the building. The bombs may have stopped, but the building was still crumbling. The system that had ran the alarms had been burnt a while ago, and the only thing she could hear was the crackling roar of the fire. He led her through hallways and down maintenance stairs. Violet felt herself go on high alert, but not because of the current situation, as dangerous as it was. Glancing down at the black-gloved hand on her arm, her mind raced with questions that she desperately wanted to ask him, but it was neither the time nor the place to do that. A sheen of sweat covered her body, and the thickening smoke seemed to clinch around her lungs, making it hard to breathe. We're almost out of here, she heard him say. And he was right. Fire, smoke, and debris were everywhere, but Violet recognized the room. It was a terminal-like area that connected to different parts of the building. An expansive glass dome ceiling hung above them, suspended by heavy metal beams, and hidden by the smoke around them. Up ahead, Violet could just barely make out the wide hallway that led to the entrance. It was as she felt his grip on her loosen that she saw the familiar flashing red light. She instinctively turned his grip on her around so that she could get both of her hands up. As a surge of purple went off, just as the bomb exploded, it took her a second after the explosion to realize that they weren't dead, and that her powers, this time, had saved them. Glancing over her shoulder, she saw the masked young man set Mr. Robinson down before straightening, tapping on the purple shield around them experimentally. Definitely not machine-based, he murmured, a hint of awe coloring his voice, as he looked at her with what appeared to be smug satisfaction. Violet was confused at his words, though they sounded familiar. He winked at her, and it was only a half a second later that Violet realized the glow of her shield illuminated his features that had been hidden beneath the shadow of his hood-familiar brown eyes and a distinct hereditary cowlick. A shrill sound cut her off, causing both of their eyes to glance up just as a metal beam came crashing down on the shield. Violet grunted, feeling the shield momentarily weaken before she pushed every ounce of strength into keeping it up. She felt tired, much tired than she should, especially when she had made shields much bigger and much stronger than this before. The young super glanced at the black band that was placed on her finger. She glared at the power inhibitor, realizing that it wasn't a typical inhibitor. It didn't totally negate her powers. It was a slightly more sophisticated version than normal inhibitors. Normal inhibitors took away your power. No other effects. This one, if her quickly draining stamina was any indication, was meant to have adverse effect on the wearer if they were able to somehow still control their powers, If she pushed herself any further, she would be drained of energy, left unconscious, and in the worst-case scenario, dead. Violet bit her lip, concentrating, legs shaking as more heavy metal beams and glass that were once above them came crashing down on them, laying haphazardly on top of the purple dome. "A little help. Here," she grunted, arms visibly shaking under the mental and physical strength her body was exerting, looking down at the masked young man, who was now kneeling down next to the still unconscious Cornelius Robinson. "Shh," he said, holding his hands up to silence her, ignoring the frustrated look she threw at him before focusing her attention back on keeping her shield up. "Give me a second. I'm thinking," she heard him mutter, before she suddenly found him standing next to her. She glanced up at him, her indigo eyes searching his, for a moment fascinated at the unfolding of plan that she could see in his. "Do you trust me?" he asked softly. Her mind said no, but yes, she said, just before he plunged the syringe she hadn't known he'd been holding into her chest right above her heart. Oh, in the back of her head, she was somewhat impressed that she still kept the shield up, despite having a needle pushed through her heart. He withdrew the syringe, but she hardly noticed as she felt a surge. An icy fire burned throughout her body, before vanishing just as quickly as it had appeared. Then, she was filled with a feeling that was similar, but much more deliciously intoxicating than adrenaline. For some reason, it reminded her of a very familiar but much more intense feeling that she couldn't quite put a name to. She hardly registered, as her masked companion placed his hands on her shoulders, from behind, until his much cooler breath tickled the hypersensitive hairs on the back of her neck as he said, "Embrace the power, Vi. Embrace the potential you're given." And as if he commanded her powers and not she, Violet's shield hummed with renewed power and strength. It pulsed once before the metal beams on top of it were repelled off it. Once all the debris and other threatening items were off, the protective purple dome above them pulsed again before vanishing. Violet fell to her knees, suddenly extremely exhausted. She mustered enough strength to look at him, unaware that her eyes were glowing an eerie purple before she collapsed, unconscious. Wilbur, escaping from her lips in a soft sigh, requiem of a timeline. Inwardly, she was almost close to hysterics. Outwardly, it looked like she was damn near ready to pummel the police officer and his police bot partner to death. Police cars and firebots surrounded the blazing building, rarely used fire hoses shooting ounces after ounces of water, with hardly any effect at the building. The news reporters were having a field day, though many, from experience, kept their distance from Franny Robinson, the woman's temper well known to many. "Don't give me that protocol mess," she hissed angrily, jabbing a finger at the taller police officer's chest, before pointing at the building with immense plumes of black smoke coming from it. "I demand that you use that overpriced piece of scrap metal that you call a police bot to check the security scanners and see if they're still in there." The officer looked around nervously, trying to pacify the shorter but very much still intimidating woman. Part of the crowd that had gathered, if not all, was focusing their attention on them. Ma'am, we're doing all we can to locate the whereabouts of Mr. Robinson and his cousin, Miss Vowell. However, there's only so much we can do while we're—" "I don't want excuses," Franny growled, her composure quickly slipping. There had been so many explosions, and though it appeared that all of Robinson Industries' workers had made it out safely, Cornelius Robinson and Violet Vowell were still unaccounted for. Franny was shouting every vulgar word she could think of at the man, when she heard the murmuring of the crowd grow louder into exclamations, as everyone seemed to be focusing on one sport of the building, the entrance. Pushing past the marked police boundary, despite the warnings of the police officer, Franny ran as close to the building as she could, the still raging fire's heat washing over her as a figure emerged from within the building. She let out a gasp of restrained relief and happiness. The worry still shook through her as she saw the unconscious bodies of her husband and New Ward over the shoulders of a hooded male. He stopped wordlessly before her, leaving enough room between them as he laid the unconscious bodies between them. "They're still alive," he reassured her gruffly. Kneeling down, Franny wrapped an arm around Violet, her maternal instincts calming down, as the girl shifted in her embrace. She then placed her hand over the still beating heart of her husband, and the breath she had been holding was finally released. "Thank you," she said, looking up at mysterious stranger. But he was already gone. Chapter 13. Revealed Introductions. He hid it well. Most people would see the go-lucky smile on his face, and, knowing who his father was, would immediately think that the boy could want for nothing. However, most people weren't his mother. When he was younger, he would come back from school explaining in great detail everything that had happened that day and the imagined adventures he and his friends had had during their afternoon break. For a while, the Robinson family had thought that the youngest Robinson was happy and surrounded by a large group of friends at school. Birthdays were always a family event, and her son never seemed to complain about not having anyone his age at the always colorfully loud and exciting celebrations in his honor. He actually seemed to enjoy the company of his aunts, uncles, and cousins despite the wide age gap. Franny never thought twice about it, though. With a family such as the Robinsons, things were always interesting, and more often than not, his uncles Art and Gaston had the maturity sometimes of someone her son's age. It wasn't until around 4th grade, the approximate beginning of Wilbur's mischief and problems with listening to authority when Mrs. Robinson had been called for a parent-teacher conference, that she realized how wrong she had been. Wilbur Robinson didn't interact with the other students. There was no Ted, whose mom always made him peanut butter and tuna sandwiches. No Nathan, who wore dinosaur pajama bottoms to school every day because he thought they made them look cool. No Emily, Sam, Andrew, or Thomas, friends that Wilbur had talked about for years, didn't exist. When she left the teacher's classroom, her eyes immediately found Wilbur, who was sitting in the chair across from the door, engrossed in one of his many superhero comics. He glanced up as he heard the sound of her heels clicking against the tiled floor. "So how long am I grounded for?" He had placed a tack on the teacher's chair, or so it was said. The principal had called her after she had gotten the initial call from Wilbur's teacher. Mr. Kropp, an older gentleman who had moved from Metroville and had been teaching for years, had a long outstanding habit of accusing students for placing tacks on his chair, even when there were none. Apparently something had happened years earlier with a student from his previous school involving a tack and super speed, whatever that meant. Franny, deciding that the debate on whether or not a tack was actually involved was the least of her concerns with her son, shook her head. Wilbur grinned, immediately throwing himself into a story on how Ted's mother had once again confused what her son wanted on his sandwich. As they neared the hover car, she turned towards her son. "Utes, Wilbur," she said, waiting for him to be buckled in his seat before continuing. "You always tell about what you and your friends do every day at school, but I don't think you've ever explained how you all became friends." He paused, looking at her with the same calculating look his father gave when he was working on a new invention. It seemed like he wasn't going to reply when he finally shrugged and said, "Because they don't care what my last name is." And with that, he returned to reading his comic book as Franny drove them back home. Franny never asked him about why he lied about having friends. Some part of her wondered if a therapist was needed. However, Mrs. Robinson knew her son, and so she let him continue his farce. She didn't tell her husband, however. In passing, she mentioned that she needed an extra hand around the house, and Franny, trusting her husband's imagination, wasn't disappointed when days later, Carl had been created equipped not only to clean and cook, but also with artificial intelligence programmed to be her son's best friend. Franny knew her son, but Cornelius, despite his long hours at work, knew his son best. So imagine her surprise, sometime after the Lewis incident, when she returned from practicing with her frogs and walked past her son's room to hear voices coming from within. It wouldn't have been strange if the laugh that caused her to stop dead in her tracks weren't one of a young girl. Opening the door, Franny peeked inside, her son's head swerving towards her with a large grin on his face, Wilbur not noticing his mother's shocked expression at the other two very real occupants in the room. "Mom, meet my friends, Adrian and Vera." Requiem of a timeline. The world watched as the last flames of Robinson Industries were put out, Every news channel in every language on almost every television set in the world watched as newscasters detailed the horrific event. Thankfully, everyone had been accounted for. Even Mr. Robinson and his young female relative had made it out unconscious but alive. However, though all the news channels were showing the same decrepit scene of the great inventor's now smoking workplace, there were many angles to the story that the media was looking at. The more kinder, family-orientated news channels focused on the bare facts. Several bombs of unknown origins had gone off inside of Cornelius Robinson's main headquarters. The authorities were still looking for clues, but as of now, no possible suspects were known. Mr. Robinson and his young female family member, who had recently came to live with the Robinson family, had been caught up in the explosion. The two with minor cuts and burns, mild smoke inhalation, and other non-fatal injuries had been pulled out to safety. Authorities were still on the lookout for possible suspects. Other news channels seemed to focus on the leaked information that right before the bombing, Cornelius had been approached about being sued by the National Union of Human Laborers for accusations of not complying with the minimum human labor requirement that had been put into place 10 years prior. Obviously, with Robinson Industries currently being nothing more than a dark pile of bricks and debris on the otherwise pristine Todayland landscape, the media really couldn't get in contact with a representative. However, there were speculations that the bombing was either caused by a radical anti-robot labor group or by Robinson himself, in an effort to destroy any evidence that could be used against him in court. A few tabloid news shows even claimed that the reason why Mr. Robinson's female relative, whom the media had still yet to find a name or picture for, was at the company that day, was because she, and not the Robinson's son, Wilbur, would be taking over the company in the future. Some tabloids claimed it was all one big publicity stunt in order to gain sympathy votes for when Cornelius ran for mayor/president/supreme ruler. However, though many a newsroom were being swarmed with the latest reports about the bombing of Robinson Industries, none seemed to mention the appearance and disappearance of the mysterious masked man, something the government and NSA made very well to keep from hitting the media. Requiem of a timeline. Not seeing much, dear brother-in-law. Though whatever caused the chain reaction that started the initial explosion had to be good because this bomb's radius is big, big, big. The world's leading cannon designer and explosive expert cackled out from the screen he was being viewed from. The blonde inventor watching the communications feed didn't even blink at his brother-in-law's eccentric personality. Instead, he turned his gaze to another screen that had a detailed blueprint of the areas of his company that had been damaged in the explosions. He shifted uncomfortably on the hospital bed, the handcuff connecting his right wrist to the bed, clanking annoyingly. Thankfully, all of his employees had gotten out safely, and most of his more important projects' research had been saved and downloaded into a secure network he could access from home. Buildings could always be replaced, however. The inventor's first clenched, repressing his anger. He could deal with attacks on just his life. It was the fact that this one involved others that made storms rage behind usually calm blue eyes. But it had to have been some sort of explosive, right? Cornelius questioned. Through the adjacent screen, he could see Gaston cross his arms, a thoughtful look on his face. There were definitely bombs. Gaston spoke in a rare moment of calmness. But they wouldn't have done this much damage to your toys. Clever Cornelius is a stickler for safety, especially of others, aren't you? Cornelius watched as his brother-in-law moved around the burned wreckage. Watchful. He was right. Normally, his security system would have located and disengaged the bomb using a very high-tech frequency before anyone in the building even knew there was a bomb threat. That knowledge wasn't well known to the public, though. He decided to take note of this for later. Suddenly, Gaston stopped, stooping down. His finger swiped against the charred outline of a crater before sticking it in his mouth. No. The bombs were a distraction, a cover-up, a sleight of hand, misdirection. You look one way, and then... He slapped his hands together. Bam! A cannonball in your face from the other direction. He chuckled again, eyes twitching at the thought of cannons. Actually, he had a new cannon design he was itching to work on, But Cornelius had asked for his help and expertise, and no matter how many screws loose some might say he had, family always came first. So if it was a ruse to divert our eyes, what was it hiding? Gaston bit his lip, looking like a child holding in a surprise that he couldn't keep quiet any longer. The Big Bang, of course. Whatever created this crater? None of the usual signs of your run-of-the-mill bomb. No, this one was different, much different. Actually, it wasn't even a bomb, but the explosion it created. Imagine. Whatever it is. I want 2 of them for my birthday, brother-in-law. A knock on the door to his room was heard, and Cornelius pressed a button on the device next to his bed that made the holoscreen surrounding him disappear, and disconnecting the call with Gaston. "Come in," he called out. A nurse peeked her head inside the room. "Mr. Robinson, how are you feeling?" With a short laugh that had very little humor and sounded more like a cough. Cornelius shrugged before motioning towards his bandaged ribs and leg held in a cast. As well as to be expected, the nurse nodded before looking back over her shoulder nervously. "The police are here to question you again, sir." He nodded. It was to be expected. Some thought the bombing had been some sort of last-ditch effort orchestrated by Robinson himself, to get some sort of pity from the public in hopes to lessen the charges he had already been given just before the explosion. He sighed. He still had to talk to Franny about those, in private, where he wasn't surrounded by police and paparazzi. "Send them in, please, Amy." "Yes, sir. I'll also contact your wife and let her know that she won't be able to see you today. Officer's orders," she said before leaving. Cornelius grimaced as he waited for the police to enter. He did not want to be the one to tell Franny Robinson that she couldn't do something. Outside, in the hallway, a figure slipped the listening device back into his pocket as he slouched further in the waiting room chair, feigning slight impatience. A nurse, Amy, came before him. "I'm sorry, hun, but your father isn't allowed visitors right now. The police are currently questioning him." Wilbur Robinson got up, flashing his signature charming smiling that made the much older woman slightly swoon before leaving. "That's fine. I already got what I came for." Requiem of a timeline. Deep breath in, deep breath out. Deep breath in, deep breath. "You sure about this, little missy?" Mustering up what little confidence she had, Violet gave a small smile to Tadaylen's best carrier deliverer, though he preferred pizza delivery the best. "Yeah, I'm sure about this. That's Uncle Art, little missy. Or Art the Magnificent, or Art the Great." He began to rattle off, not noticing as the teenage next to him exited his hover delivery truck into the door slammed shut. Rolling down the window, he yelled, "Make sure to catch a ride with Wilbur after school," before rising into the air and taking off. Taking a deep breath at the name of the boy who had avoided her for days successfully since the fire, Violet began the climb up the imposing stairs to Todayland High, though she was sure that what she saw in the fire wasn't a trick of the light, and that he was really the hooded man who helped her. At the moment, she had more pressing concerns on her mind that distracted her from her half-formed plans to get answers from the youngest Robinson later. She gripped the bag she carried tightly to herself as she tried to quickly make her way up the stairs without notice. However, luck was not on her side. She had been allowed to leave from the hospital a few days ago with minor burns, and no signs of serious damage due to smoke inhalation. The topic of the Robinson Industries explosion was still a hot topic, not only in Todayland but the world. However, if the blatant stares she got as soon as she stepped out of Art's hover vehicle was any clue, she might find herself as the next hot topic. Do you think that's her? It has to be. Captain Art Framaguchi told her to get a ride with Wilbur. I thought she'd look different. Is she and Wilbur dating? Can't be. They're cousins. Even the Robinsons aren't that weird, right? What is weird? A voice cut in over the nondiscreet whispering. Is that you all have enough time to gossip and speculate like old maids, and yet it does nothing more than to make you all seem pretty pathetic, and quite honestly, sad. How about you all? I don't know. Actually do something productive, and get your own lives instead about worrying about others. Violet, whose gaze had been burning into the ground before her, felt her neck snap up towards the source of her apparent savior. Before her stood what the young super in her mind could only think of as a model, A tweed black and red floral patterned blazer and black knee-length skirt was draped perfectly on a lithe figure, and inky jet black hair was pulled neatly into a side ponytail that draped over the shoulder, exposing a pale face framed with cat-eye framed glasses. Perfectly coordinated heels clicked with authority towards Violet, and she couldn't help but blush as a slender but strong arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her closer to her apparent savior. Besides, she's our new toy. And with that, Violet was spun around, the arm around her waist removed to instead hook with her arm, as she was pulled into the school. She was speechless, caught off guard as she let this girl drag her away from what she knew would have otherwise been an embarrassing situation. It was finally after a few minutes that Violet was able to gain some motor control. As if sensing this, the still unnamed girl tightened her grip on Violet, not threateningly, but it still gave the message that the young super shouldn't expect to be released anytime soon. Violet was about to question this girl and find out who she was when she was cut off. "You're in all my classes, which wasn't easy to do, by the way, though not impossible. You're welcome, by the way, dear," the much taller girl said matter-of-factly, as she took off her glasses with her free hand, placing them on the top of her head and revealing hazel eyes outlined in perfectly applied eyeliner and eyeshadow. Violet felt her gut clench slightly as her old friend Insecurity began to appear. Stopping at the intersection of two deserted hallways, Violet was finally released. "Who are you?" Violet found her voice. She was responded with a smirk before her arm was linked with again. "Why, your new best friend. Requiem of a timeline." Eventually, Violet learned that her guide was named Adrian. The super side of her wondered if she would later regret her decision to trust Adrian. However, as a teenager, she couldn't help but to metaphorically and literally cling to Adrian. In her eyes, Adrian was a girl who radiated beauty, confidence, and surprisingly a calmness that made the nervous knots in Violet's stomach loosen. She was patient with Violet, not giving her strange looks or annoyed sighs at her, when in one of their classes their teacher merely popped into existence, a hologram substitute teacher, or when she didn't know how to work the food fabricator in the cafeteria, creating a long line of impatient students behind her. Adrian would merely laugh good-naturedly at her, patting her on the shoulder before explaining how things worked. Currently, they were sitting in the glass conservatory on top of the school for lunch. Violet let out a sigh, curling her toes in the organically grown grass as she propped herself up with her arms. She much preferred the calm and colorful conservatory compared to the loud and cramped cafeteria. Other students lounged leisurely around them, visible but content and keep to themselves. Nothing like the cafeteria where Violet had felt like eyes were piercing her from every direction. "Maybe that's why Adrian brought me up here," she thought. Not only was she the new girl, she was the new girl living with the Robinsons. And despite all the eccentric experiences she had experienced since beginning her stay at the Robinsons' home, like the time she had almost gotten run over by one of Aunt Billy's giant toy trains, she realized that the family kept very much to themselves, and not many outsiders knew what actually went on in the home of the great Cornelius Robinson. Munching thoughtfully on a fry, the super and Violet began to think about the Robinson family, realizing earlier on and being extremely grateful that Adrian much preferred to enjoy her lunch reading in silence. Too, though all members of the Robinson family were interesting, her mind focused on one Wilbur Robinson. His total lack of presence in the Robinson home almost made her question if he even existed. If it wasn't for Carl's mutterings every now and then about idiotic swirly-headed teenage boys climbing through windows late at night, she would have thought that he was merely a figment of her imagination. Him and his masked brown eyes. She popped another fry into her mouth, rolling onto her back to look at the glass ceiling above her, refracted light from the sun playing in her vision. If she were to be totally honest, she wasn't sure what she was most annoyed at, Wilbur Robinson or the black band around her finger. She wanted answers. Violet was concerned with the black band. She had known it was a power inhibitor, but regular power inhibitors merely cancelled out or reduced a super's power, and extremely difficult to take off. It wasn't supposed to leave her unconscious for 3 days, like it did after the fire. She wondered if Mirage and Lucius knew. Thinking of the two made the girl deflate a little. Missing her family. She also wanted to know what the Robinson boy had planned, and why he was dressed up as a super. More like vigilante, she thought with a scoff. She knew she could trust Cornelius, and Franny had made it obvious that her husband had clued her in on who Violet really was, but the other Robinson family members weren't supposed to know, as a safety precaution. As far as they knew, she really was Cornelius's cousin. Her identity was her greatest weapon, and the only remaining thing she had of her old life. Knowing that Wilbur knew she had powers made her uneasy, despite how welcoming his family made her feel. Plus, what was that stuff she had been injected with? It had made her feel stronger. It was adrenaline. It was power. It was complete ecstasy. She had never felt like that before. And the scariest thing was the idea of having more of whatever that injection was played teasingly in her mind. The sound of loud, open-mouth munching and Adrian's disgusted groan pulled Violet out of her thoughts to sit up and stare straight into the eyes of one of her biggest annoyances, who was currently helping himself to the rest of her fries. Caught between startled and seriously ticked off, Violet felt herself speechless, her pale skin coloring slightly with red. She watched as Wilbur Robinson finished her fries from where he was squatting before standing straight, walking towards her and passing her to sit next to Adrian on a nearby bench. "You skipped class again," Adrian stated, sounding somewhat exasperated, as Wilbur took the book she was reading. He flipped through some of pages before turning himself on the bench so that his long legs were hanging off the armrest and his head was being pillowed by Adrian's lap. Violet's brow raised slightly, curious at this. "I was visiting Dad," he answered before finally glancing over at Violet. "He's okay," he said, as a grin began to slowly form on his features. "Thanks to your force field, that is." Adrian pushed him off her lap and off the bench, so he wasn't able to see Violet's face drain of any color, her eyes frantically scanning the area around them to see if anyone had overheard them. But the room appeared to be clear, except for themselves. "Now, look what you've done," Adrian sighed, getting up before moving towards Violet, taking her hands and pulling her up. The taller girl glared over her shoulder. "You were supposed to wait until after school to start asking her questions." Wilbur got up, dusting himself off, the grin totally gone from his face. "I don't have time. I need answers," he said, walking towards them. Violet was thinking if she could somehow escape from these two, when she felt Wilbur's hand clamped down on her shoulder-brown eyes. Meeting indigo, he leaned forward, and the silly, ridiculous hormonal teenage part of her wondered if he was about to kiss her. Instead, he whispered in her ear, "I know who you are." Requiem of a timeline. She turned off the TV. The loss of the screen's glow took away most of the room's light, but her eyes, or more correctly, I quickly adjusted. The news was still covering the incident at Robinson Industries. Thankfully, nothing that would compromise Violet had been leaked to the media. The NSA was good at those sorts of things. Mirage made a mental note to go see how the rest of the Incredibles were doing with their rehabilitation. She also needed to get one of her agents to start making up cover stories for the rest of the family, starting with Dash. With his super speed, it was expected that he would be the first of the family to recover first. Mirage frowned, as always not knowing what to do with her rare days off, before moving around her small but comfortable apartment to the kitchen. Reaching into the cabinet, she took out a bottle of scotch and a glass, setting them both on counter before turning around to find her bottle opener. Tucking a strand of white hair that had gotten loose from her bun behind her ear, she found the bottle opener before turning around. Jade eyes narrowed as she saw her once empty glass now had 3 perfect cubes of ice in it. Before she could get closer to inspect it, her windows exploded, glass flying everywhere. Managing to duck underneath her small table quickly, the NSA agent only received a few minor cuts. That was the least of her problems, though. The ticking time bomb was... 5, 4, 3... Damn. 2, 1... Boom. Chapter 14. Tentative partnership. After she and her family became the Incredibles, it did not take long for Violet to figure out that Mirage was a femme fatale in more than just looks. The NSA did not like loose ends, and would have put Syndrome's right-hand woman either in jail or wiped her memory clean if it wasn't for certain talents that the woman had acquired in her line of work. Though Mirage's main role in regards to bringing in Mr. Incredible had been more on the technological and, one might even say, seducing side, it took more than a pretty face and nice toys to take down some of the supers who had unfortunately met their demise due to Syndrome's evil plans. The man formerly known as Buddy Pine wasn't the only who had gotten his hands dirty. Nonetheless, said talents were how a month after the whole Syndrome incident, when the Incredibles were just starting to lead supers back out of obscurity, that Agent Dicker suggested more like ordered that the two eldest Parr children would receive hand-to-hand combat training from the enigmatic woman. Though Violet wasn't as cocky about her powers as Dash was, when she first entered the sparsely furnished room that would serve as the place for their training within the basement of the NSA, she was slightly skeptical when Mirage told her and Dash to both come at her with all they had, though separately, the two Parr children had various weaknesses that were easy to exploit once found. Together with Violet's force field and Dash's super speed, they were close to unstoppable. Well, as they would soon find out, close to unstoppable did not equal unstoppable. What? Violet questioned, eyes wide, when her signature sphere-shaped force field did not appear. She looked at her hands. There was no glow. Something was wrong. Ew. Violet, stop messing around! Dash yelled at her as Mirage began to run towards them. When he saw that Violet was too preoccupied with staring at her hands than at the woman charging towards them, he rolled his eyes before grabbing her arm. A combination of his high speed, along with Violet's lightweight, usually allowed the maneuvering of himself and his sister relatively easy, so it was Dash's turn to be surprised when not only could he not move, but he found his feet incredibly uncoordinated and slow. What the? All words were cut off, as both supers felt their feet swept from under them, eyes suddenly staring at the ceiling in disbelief. First lesson of the day. Mirage smirked over them, one finger raised. Your powers are your greatest weapons, but also your greatest weaknesses. You both need to learn how to handle any situation with or without them, especially if your opponent has access to a power-inhibited room. She extended out her hands, both reluctantly taking her offer to help them back on their feet, before she stepped back, moving her entire body in a graceful motion, rolling into a fighting stance as if it was second nature. She cocked her head to the side, smirk still present as green eyes danced with mirth at their bewildered and nearly terrified expressions. Second lesson: don't die. Requiem of a timeline. I know who you are. The color leaving her face turned her an interesting shade of pale. Wilbur thought amusedly to himself. He ignored Adrian's pointed glare at his back and instead turned his attention in favor of studying the girl before him. It was the first time he actually looked at her, instead of just her powers. She was about average height, though the growth spurt he had in 7th grade still had him a full head taller than her. She was pretty, he thought, but in any other circumstance he probably wouldn't have given her a second look, especially with how her hair sometimes acted as a shield, hiding her away from the world. Now, though, his focus entirely on her, he noticed small details. There was a very thin, almost unnoticeable scar running close to her hairline. She wasn't a thin stick like he had thought. His hand on her upper arm feeling toned, intense muscle underneath. Wilbur grinned, watching as her indigo eyes not contacts, he thought somewhat intrigued, narrowed before she shoved his hand off her shoulder, taking a step back. Look, she sighed, crossing her arms. I don't know what you're talking about, so can you please, just leave me alone? He saw her glance towards the exit and decided to take a step, blocking the view. This obviously wasn't the right move to make, since she took another step back, her entire body language screaming that she was about to run at the first opportunity. Uh-oh, he thought. He needs your help. They both looked at Adrian, who had taken a seat on the bench, back to reading her book. She glanced up at them, her gaze belying her bored expression. We can all play coy as much as long as you both like, but that won't hide the fact that you, she said, pointing to Wilbur, have your cover blown, and you, she said, pointing to Violet, have a very interesting set of talents. Besides, Adrian continued, turning a page, Wilbur has much more to lose if you choose to disclose his after-school activities to the media. He's essentially at your mercy. Wilbur wanted to face-palm himself. Adrian sometimes came off too blunt, and he was afraid that he was showing too much of his hand to this Violet girl. However, when he looked back at Violet, her body wasn't as tense, meaning she had at least decided not to run. For now, he let out a soft sigh, hooking his thumbs into the pockets of his jeans as he looked anywhere but her large indigo eyes. Look, I know we barely know each other, and you probably have a reason for wanting to hide your powers, Wilbur said, looking anywhere but her, one hand rubbing the back of his neck, while the other hand, with thumbs still hooked on his pocket, tapped an agitated rhythm. But I need you. My family needs you. That fire wasn't normal. It shouldn't have even happened with the number of safety protocols my father had designed into that building. Could have been a fluke, Violet offered. A flaw or something that caused the fire. Unlikely, but possible. But it wasn't, Wilbur exclaimed before he realized his hands were clutching desperately at her shoulder. Look, he said, his voice soft and vulnerable. He felt too exposed, but he had to get through to her, even if his pride took a blow. You haven't been living with us long, but you should have realized by now that there are some people who don't like the good that Cornelius Robinson is trying to do for the world. There's always been attempts against him, but none this big. He stared deeply into his eyes, searching them, pleading with them. He could see she was very close to the edge. All she needed was a nudge. Please, I can't just sit around and watch as my family is attacked. Our family... She broke eye contact with him, looking at the ground. I'm sorry, she said, hair falling in her face as she pushed past him towards the exit. But they're not my family, and I really can't help you. Wilbur froze, shocked. That's not what he had expected. His blood boiled. He spun around, ready to sprint after her, to scream at her, to beg her to help him. Don't, Adrian said, placing a firm hand on his shoulder to keep him place. I'll take care of this, his friend said before heading towards the exit that Violet just exited, leaving Wilbur to stew in a whirlwind of emotions. Requiem of a timeline. The entire apartment had been cleared out, and accommodations had been made. None of the tenants willing to tempt fate after hearing about the gas leak that had created a small explosion in apartment 1949. This made it easier for unidentifiable agents to enter the building and do a sweep for anything out of place. And heard what? Lucius Best wheeled himself into the apartment, where a few agents were combing through the rooms and deinstalling any high-tech equipment. Once they were done, the apartment would have no trace of the NSA, and the civilian remodelers wouldn't even be aware of the many hiding spots and off-the-market security equipment that had once been installed and hidden in the room. Report, Lucius ordered a nearby agent. It seems like the device was projected through the windows, sir, meaning that the suspect had to be in one of the adjacent buildings, since we're so high up. We're currently doing a sweep through all the security footage of the surrounding buildings for a possible suspect, but there has been nothing yet, the agent informed. Keep looking into it. Any agents not on level 3 or above missions should turn their focus on this. Yes, sir, the agent said, about to turn away and return to his work when he paused. Also, my condolences, sir. Everyone knows that you and Agent Mirage were good friends. She will be missed. Nodding, Lucius waved the agent away, staring at the tarp-covered windows that blue-waved lightly in the breeze. After a few minutes, he turned his chair towards the kitchen. Most of the walls were black and missing pieces from the explosion. One cabinet, near beneath the sink, had managed to survive with its door still hinged. Opening the door, Lucius found a mess of broken gas and the strong smell of spilt alcohol. A bottle of whiskey, however, towards the back, was still intact. Leaning forward, he reached for it and rolled towards a nearby table, grabbing an intact glass somewhere along the way. To Mirage, he said, using the bottle to give a slight salute before moving his hand over his glass. 3 perfect cubes of ice appearing before he poured the whiskey in and took a long sip. Requiem of a timeline. Violet tried to will her heart to calm down, but the sporadic hummingbird pattern continued to pound against her chest. Somewhat disorientated and not really having the motivation to find her next class, she turned into a deserted hallway, her back hitting a wall as she slowly allowed herself to slide down to the floor. Oh, it was too much. He was just too much. Too intense. How could he really expect that much out of her? Her powers were on the fritz thanks to the power inhibitor that she wore, unable to take off. But even if she was at full strength, her doubts and fears crippled her. Coward, that's what you are, she thought to herself. If he knew how you messed up things for your own family, he wouldn't want you anywhere near yours. Tears built up, just on the verge of spilling. Oh, come now, darling, no time to feel sorry for yourself. A shadow fell on her, and looking up, Violet stared up as Adrian looked down at her with a wide Cheshire smile. Adrian, No, Adrian said, cutting her off. Don't even finish that thought. Violet was tugged effortlessly onto her feet, and her arm was hooked with Adrian's as she was guided towards the school's entrance. We're playing a bit of hooky. I hope you don't mind, but we need to go to a fitting. Violet dug her heels in, managing to make Adrian pause. If Wilbur was confusing, she thought, then Adrian was an enigma. Fitting? Fitting for what? Adrian's smile grew wider with mischief. The last suit you'll ever wear? Invisigirl. Chapter 15. Legacy of the Capeless. Some people question the relationship between Wilbur Robinson and Adrian Bradley. Since sometime during their freshman year of high school, when Adrian transferred from a private school to Wilbur's high school, they had always seemed to be inseparable. So certes, the young Robinson heir was not an unusual sight either behind stage or front row at Todayland's fashion runway, showcasing the newest design. He was even once a model in one of the earlier showcases, a decision that was never repeated after he walked down the runway, comically sashaying his hips and making a duck-face pout at the audience and cameras. Adrian still hasn't forgiven him for that incident. It also drew a lot of attention when Adrian not only was seen at many of Franny Robinson's concerts, but it was somehow revealed that Adrian was invited to and participated in family-only Robinson events. With Wilbur's charming public persona and Adrian's pose and grace, many began to wonder if the two were in some sort of arranged marriage. Now and then, an unfounded rumor would spark about their relationship, but the rumors were never true. Adrian and Wilbur were just friends, siblings if anything. They weren't bonded by romantic love, but the deep bonds that were carved into them by tragic loss. Requiem of a timeline. A voice that sounded distinctly like her father's nagged in the back of her mind how reckless this was. If someone recognized her super identity, she was supposed to run, not sit on a posh cream-colored couch with jade-green delicate teacup being held precariously in her shaking hands. Violet was alone in the room, but she could hear the opening and closing of cabinets while Adrian put together some snacks in the kitchen that was separated by a swinging door from the spacious living room. Glancing at the door to the kitchen to make sure her host would still be there for a while, Violet quietly placed her untouched tea down, patting her way to the opposite wall, where the floor-to-ceiling window stood. Looking out, Violet had a brief sense of dizziness at how high the penthouse apartment stood. The view provided a perspective of Todayland that stood above the bubble transport system and the regulated height of the car traffic. Feeling the seeds of anxiety start to take root, at the still alien-feeling time she found herself in, Violet took a step back and turned her gaze to something else in the room. On the adjacent wall, she saw what looked like a collage of finished and unfinished fashion designs sprinkled with a few photos. Though Violet found her eyes drawn to many of the beautifully drawn outfits, a photograph, half hidden behind a woman's pantsuit design, caught her attention. Glancing back at the entrance to the kitchen to confirm that Adrian was still putting together something for them to snack on, Violet gently moved aside the design sketch to get a better look of the photo. It must have been taken years ago since a much younger Wilbur Robinson was in the center. He had on a blue shirt with a spaceship on it and a grin that just screamed youthful mischievousness. However, to Violet, his face seemed much more open, and the grin on his face seemed natural and not forced. On his left and his right were two similarly styled children, twins by the looks of it. Before she could get a better look, though, she heard Adrian's steps back towards her and covered the picture again with the design drawings. They're designs for a collection I'm working on," Adrian said softly, noticing Violet by the wall, entering the room with a tray that carried a teapot, 2 cups, and an assorted variety of tea cakes. "I haven't exactly finished, but I'm hoping some recent inspiration will give the collection the right amount of oomph it needs to dazzle on the runway." Violet found herself nodding as if she knew anything about the type of oomph that was needed in any sort of creative process. Crossing the open area of the loft, she took a seat on a plush stool, watching as Adrian filled the dainty cups with the liquid aroma of steeped flowers that filled the space between them, replacing her earlier untouched cup. There was a certain amount of thoughtless grace to Adrian's movements that Violet found so mesmerizing that she forced herself to look away, a light blush on her cheeks, unaware as Adrian flashed an amused knowing smirk at her. "So, you know who I was. Better to just dive right into it," Violet thought. Adrian smirked over the rim of her own teacup before taking a sip. "You mean, who you are?" Violet frowned, clasping her hands tightly together to keep them from shaking. Adrian watched her with an unreadable look before setting down her teacup. "You know, after hearing so many stories of you and your family from Edna, I was afraid she had just gone into one of her overindulgent rants that she often finds herself giving." Finally coming to the conclusion that the tea wasn't tampered with, Violet had taken a large gulp only to choke on it at the familiar name. She allowed Adrian to come behind her and pat her on the back until she could breathe normally again, a spew of questions rushing out. "Edna Mole, you know Edna. How? Where is she? How is she doing?" She didn't realize that she had gripped Adrian's hand, her hold on it tightening with each question until Adrian gently tugged herself out of the super's grip before moving to sit back to her seat across from the still stunned young super. Violet blushed as she realized her actions. A part of Violet felt silly for wanting to see the small spitfire older woman so badly, but the another part of her, the part that was still adjusting to this new time, wanted to cling on to anything and anyone from her old life. Though a tad demanding, Edna Mole was far from the worst person for Violet to miss from her old life. Adrian merely smiled at her, as if she said something amusing. If possible, Violet's blush grew even hotter under Adrian's intense stare. Ducking her head down, Violet allowed her hair to shield her still red cheeks. "Why did you bring me here, Adrian, if you're trying to blackmail me?" She paused, willing the stinging of unfallen tears in her eyes to stop. Tears wouldn't make things okay. Tears wouldn't bring her closer to her family. It had been days since she had heard any updates about them, and the last update had been the same as the ones before. No visible improvement. A tissue pressed softly against her cheeks, wiping away the tears that she had not known were already falling. "Violet, look at me." Reluctant indigo met unguarded brown eyes. Violet was struck by the intensity that they held, but also by the mirroring pain, though much older, that she saw reflected in them. "I'm not trying to blackmail you. I haven't even told Wilbur who you really are. Despite him figuring out about your powers, he doesn't know when you're from." The tenseness in Violet's shoulders relaxed a bit at that piece of information. "But," Adrian continued, "I will reiterate what Wilbur said before. We do need you. The city needs you. Even now, you're much stronger than you think." Adrian wiped the last of Violet's tears away before cupping her face gently in her hands. "And Todayland needs that strength. Wilbur needs that strength. I can't help him the way you can." A dark look flashed over Adrian's face, but as soon as it appeared, it was gone, replaced so quickly by Adrian's pleading expression. "It would bring me so much peace of mind to know that you're out there with him. He's one of the few good things left in my life. What he's doing is dangerous. Yes, as I'm sure you're well aware. And you never asked him to stop?" Adrian laughed, a sound that maybe years ago would have been more aptly labeled a sob, as she shook her head. "Do you really think a Robinson can be told to stop doing something Their motto is keep moving forward. And despite their loyalty, once it's been given, they will keep moving forward, with or without you. Biting her lip, Violet tried to push back on the guilty feeling that was beginning to twist her stomach. This wasn't her problem. This couldn't be her problem. And yet, she looked up at Adrian's eyes again, which she instantly regretted, as her stomach clenched, her desire to mind her own business and play it safe going against years as a protector. She wished her parents were here. She wished she had their guidance, or Dash's willingness to jump right in, or even Jack's childish ability to see the good in everyone and everything. She missed her family, but most importantly, she missed herself. I'll think about it. It wasn't the answer that Adrian wanted, but the fashion designer nodded all the same. I suppose that's all I can ask for. Reaching under her seat, she pulled out a white-wrapped box that Violet had not noticed before. Take this. I'm sure you already know what this is. And no, I won't take no for an answer in regards to you leaving here without it. You don't have to do anything with it, she said, seeing the beginnings of a protest from the other girl. But it is yours, and Edna would want you to have it. Violet looked down at the box in her lap, hands shaking as they ran softly along its side. Adrian was right. Violet knew very well what was inside, and she yearned to put on what she knew would feel like second skin to her, what was rightfully a part of her family's legacy. Her heart clenched, though, resisting the urge as she nodded, barely trusting her voice above a whisper. Okay, thank you. About half an hour later, Violet found herself back at the Robinsons' estate. Her appetite had long since gone, and she felt a heavy weight on her shoulders. She headed directly to the guest house, kicking off her shoes as soon as she entered, and leaving the box on a nearby table. Though the lights were voice-automated, she didn't even have the energy to speak as she made her way to the shadowy shape of her bed. Her plan for the night was to just pass out and not think about the inexplicable coiling feeling of guilt she felt at the bottom of her stomach. She was in a strange place, in a time that wasn't originally hers. With no backup, she had a right to want to play things safe, to be selfish, right? This wasn't her city. Supers were essentially extinct in this time, and most importantly, her powers were being restricted by the power inhibitor ring that she was forced to wear. She was just ordinary. Kicking off her shoes, Violet slipped under her covers, ready to let sleep overtake her when she felt a body next to hers and a hand covering her mouth. Don't scream. Violet froze, fear gripping her. Before her vision turned red, she was just ordinary. That didn't mean she was defenseless. Planting her feet on the mattress, Violet grabbed the arm attached to the offending hand and used her center of gravity along with the intruder's surprise to flip the person over her and onto the floor. Violet did a quick roll off the side of the bed, pinning her intruder down. When she saw who was under her, she withheld letting out a frustrated scream. You know, she growled, once amethyst eyes clashed with brown eyes. I'm beginning to question your place as a gentleman. Wilbur smirked from under her, as if their current positions was something he was used to. Never claimed I was one, princess. And then he flipped her so she was underneath his weight. Perhaps it was a combination of all the stress that Violet had been trying to compartmentalize for weeks since she woke up in a new time. Maybe the talk with Adrian had more of an effect than she originally imagined. Or maybe she was just so freaking tired of Wilbur's smirk. Whatever it was, Violet was angry and frustrated, and she wanted control now. Placing one knee against his stomach, Violet managed to get her other leg out from under him and planted her foot on his hip. With a hard push from her legs, Violet separated herself from him and quickly rolled to her feet. Wilbur did the same, rubbing at where she had kicked him. He was only given a few seconds before a swift kick was aimed at his head. He ducked, leaning back on his haunches and into a backflip that allowed him to hop back up to his feet. Well, that wasn't nice, he said offhandedly. Violet threw a pillow at him. So is breaking into someone's room. Wilbur blocked it. Admittedly, not my best idea with someone who, judging by that kick you aimed at my head, is obviously trained. But to be fair, this is my family's property. Violet's scowl grew deeper. Okay, listen, Wilbur said, hands raising up in a pacifying motion. We can do this back and forth, you being angry at me type of thing, and then me being my dashingly handsome self. I'm sure it would be fun. Really. We can set up an appointment for it sometime next month. Your people call my people, or... He left unfinished. Unable to help her curiosity, Violet heard herself question, "Or what?" Wilbur grinned, a look that set Violet's nerves even more on high alert. "Or I could give you a real tour of the city. Requiem of a timeline. He was supposed to be going fast. Fast. Faster. The fastest. But he wasn't. He was held down. Unmoving. He felt sluggish, drowsy. His limbs felt heavy, and his eyes refused to open. He heard muffled sounds. Voices, maybe. He wanted to go. To go, go, go! But his body wouldn't respond. The only thing that changed were the sounds that were once muffled suddenly cleared, as if someone opened a door and he could hear voices clearly again. "Sir, we can't keep giving him sedatives. His body just burns right through them in half the time due to his fast metabolism. Then just up the dosage." But sir, the side effects. The best case scenario is he only becomes addicted to the drug. If we... A cold breeze. Gurgling noises. A loud thump. He struggled to open his eyes, to see what was going on, who the voices belonged to, who they were talking about. Suddenly, hazy blue eyes opened, blinking against the harsh bright light before a shadow fell over them. Go back to sleep, Dash. He felt a pinch at his side before his world swirled, and he was dragged back into the sleepless realms of unconsciousness, but not before uttering one last slurred word. Luscious.